Chapter 961, Hidden World Side. Of course I know, Kismet was still grinning, but your advancement method is obviously not death weaving. Wherever you've been, not only is there no shadow of death shrouding the area, but there's also a vitality of change. I think being able to become your target. What an honor. Since Kismet had already guessed that becoming a target of Symphony of Fate would bring great benefits, Saul immediately changed his tone. If I agree, what benefits can you give me? Kismet had prepared before coming to find Saul. Aren't you looking for Byron? I know where he is and can take you there. Saul crossed his arms. I've already walked this far. Do you think I won't be able to find him? Kismet shook his head and smiled helplessly. Master is really not easy to fool. He looked at Saul with burning eyes. What about all the intelligence regarding red worms? I guarantee that everything Alec knows, I know too. Saul stared at Kismet's cunning smiling face without blinking. I really suspect now that the red worms were actually brought in by you. I really don't have that ability, Kismet said with a grin. Fine, I agree. Saul agreed readily, but you also have to fulfill what you said earlier about taking me to where Byron is. The other party laughed twice. Master really knows how to do business. Every time I select a target, I need to make some preparations, but this isn't a suitable place. Since they'd reached an agreement, Saul spoke honestly, so I hope you can first help me rescue Senior Byron. Kismet winked at Saul. Master can rest assured, I also trust Master very much. Previously, when Saul had Kismet exchange his freedom for the method to advance to 4th rank, he had given Kismet his freedom first, not afraid at all that Kismet would run away. So now Kismet told Saul that he also trusted Saul. However, Kismet didn't know about the existence of causality. The strong binding force of fate lines couldn't be detected by a mere 4th rank wizard before it truly took effect. Saul's face had already been toughened by now, and he felt no embarrassment at all facing Kismet's trust. Little brother Master, you've been circling around the Star Observatory Tower. You must be guessing that Byron is imprisoned in the observatory, right? Saul nodded. It should be a relatively hidden place. Very hidden. It could even be said that while it's near the Star Observatory Tower, it's not really near the Star Observatory Tower. Stop beating around the bush. Could there be a hidden world side here? Kismet's eyes crinkled with laughter. You guessed right. Would you like to guess where the entrance to that world side is? Saul looked up. Not far away on the Star Observatory Tower, that enormous red worm was still slowly twisting its head. Its huge mouth opened and closed, as if devouring the magic power in the air. World sides are connected to the main world through a spatial entrance, and red worms came in through the Stargate spatial entrance. Could the hidden world side be near its head? You guessed right again. Kismet alternated between formal and casual address, speaking entirely according to his mood. The hidden world side is inside the Star Observatory Tower. If you want to go in, you first need to find a way to sneak inside. Sneak inside, Saul frowned. His concealment abilities were really mediocre, and he was always discovered by 4th rank wizards. If Saul used fate lines to spy, he definitely wouldn't be discovered, but fate lines entering a world side couldn't rescue Byron. Don't worry, my little brother Master. There aren't many normal people left in the Stargate Council now. With red worms running rampant, the living people are all too busy to handle everything, let alone Chairman Alec himself. So sneaking in is still quite easy. People who can see red worms won't be devoured by red worms, Saul asked. It's not that they can't be devoured, but they'll be recognized as the same species by red worms. But if you anger them, they'll still eat you. Saul thought of the red worm that had been eliminated by his star-shaped eyes. If it were still alive, it would probably be angered, right? It's not easy to anger red worms either, since conventional methods can't even touch them. That's right, Kismet swayed his silver long hair. So, will people who can see redworms be devoured and controlled by redworms? No, redworms are also a brainless species. They don't have such cunning. Kismet held up his index finger and waved it twice in front of Saul. Confusing people's memories is something the Stargate Council does themselves. Stripping wizards of their memories of red worms and having them continue working for the Stargate Council in their original positions. It could only be said that the Stargate Council was really short-staffed now. In that case, Corey was more likely taken away by people from the Stargate Council. Under what circumstances would they take away controlled people? Saul looked at the campfire in front of him. The flames kept twisting but always pointed toward the sky. Some sparks scattered out and quickly disappeared. So Saul answered his own question. It should be when they can't control them. He stood up and patted the dust off his bottom. I know how to sneak in. Before that, tell me all the information about red worms. After I get Senior Byron out, I'll prepare the magical formation for Symphony of Fate. Symphony of Fate, Kismet's eyes flickered. I really like that name. As dawn broke, a new batch of wizard apprentices participating in the Stargate Council selection rode carriages from the capital of Olga Duchy toward the Star Observatory Tower. As long as they could pass the selection, even wizard apprentices could stay and work inside the observatory. Moreover, with the Stargate Council as backing, unless their aptitude was particularly poor, advancing to third-level wizard apprentice was very easy. But then again, people with particularly poor aptitude didn't even qualify to participate in the selection. Second-level apprentice Jeffrey stepped down from his carriage with excited yet nervous feelings. These carriages would wait in place for half a day to take back those who failed the selection. These wizards were all very generous with money. Some would even throw a gold coin. Although those being taken back wouldn't be in a good mood, as long as the coachman served them carefully, the fare could still be received in full. After all, these wizard apprentices wouldn't dare cause trouble near the Stargate Council. Jeffrey straightened his collar again, calmed his active soul body once more, and stepped toward the main gate. As a result, when he got to the end of the line, he found that he knew the apprentice in front of him. Saul, Jeffrey patted Saul's shoulder. What a coincidence we came at the same time. The apprentice standing in front of Saul looked back, said nothing, but felt somewhat puzzled. Was this person standing behind me just now? However, he didn't think much about it, since the two people behind him had already started chatting enthusiastically. Yeah, I originally saw an acquaintance and suddenly got off the carriage, thought I wouldn't be able to travel with you. Saul appeared much more enthusiastic than yesterday. The two looked just like old friends, who had already become very familiar with each other. Chapter 962, Floating World Side. Saul casually registered his information and entered the Star Observatory Tower with Jeffrey. He discovered that the environment here was very loose, and every working wizard was unusually busy, as if they had endless work to do. Seeing that the interior of the Star Observatory Tower was in this state, Saul simply stopped pretending at all and immediately left the selection crowd, heading to the upper floors. The entire tower body of the Star Observatory Tower had no windows, so Saul had his nightmare butterfly go out from time to time to confirm the position of the red worm's mouthparts. He encountered many people along the way, but none of them paid attention to Saul, as if they couldn't see him. Every time I sneak around to go somewhere, I basically get caught right after arriving. Now that I'm walking in openly, no one cares. Bait in the diary laughed. Perhaps they can't imagine that you would dare to break into the Stargate Council headquarters. Soon Saul arrived at the corresponding position, but the entrance to the world side wasn't so easily discovered by outsiders. The position he was at was a hollow floor. That is, This floor had no ground in the middle and was connected to the floor below. Combined with the Star Observatory Tower's floor height of nearly 4 meters, a huge space over 7 meters high appeared before Saul. This should be it, but is there really no one guarding even here? Saul extended his mental power and swept it around this space, but didn't discover the entrance to the world side. The several world sides Saul had visited before, he had either entered without any warning or had keys like the Chaos Realm compass, or was brought in by Glare family members. He had never struggled to find an entrance. Now, although he guessed where the world side entrance was located, he hadn't sensed the specific position of this entrance or how to enter the world side. Saul took out the Chaos Realm compass and tried to use it to sense the existence of spatial gaps. The pointer on the compass kept rotating without any pattern. Saul thought to himself, "It seems this compass can only target the Chaos Realm." He put away the compass. Mental power can't detect spatial fissures, so what about fate lines? Saul sensed left and right again. No one was passing by nearby. One of his hands quietly transformed into a gray tentacle hidden in his sleeve. Then several white semi-transparent thin threads emerged from his sleeve opening, floating in the air like spider silk and probing the air like cat whiskers. One white semi-transparent thin thread split from 1 into 2 in the air, 2 into 4, and finally became dense whiskers that swept across the space between the two floors. Under this carpet-style search, Saul finally sensed that slight anomaly of the world side entrance. Saul immediately retracted his fate lines, flew into midair and reached out to touch what seemed like empty space. The next second he felt a peculiar suction force. His entire person seemed to fall into a straw. His body and soul body were both stretched and narrowed, then sprayed out from the other end of the straw. Saul steadied himself, and upon looking up, he saw a calf-sized red worm floating past in the air, motionless like a balloon. Looking down, Saul discovered he was at high altitude, with hundreds of red worms floating beneath his feet. Saul tried to search for the ground through the gaps between these floating fat worms, but he discovered there seemed to be no ground here. Everything was floating in midair. Floating around Saul in the greatest numbers were motionless red worms. Saul couldn't touch them and didn't know if they were dead or alive. Sensing someone seemed to be approaching, Saul flashed and hid behind a red worm, simultaneously concealing his form and blending himself with the background of this world. Before entering, Saul had left a temporary coordinate outside the Star Observatory Tower. If he encountered any trouble, he could teleport directly. Sensing now, the coordinate's presence was still clear. Obviously, Saul could move between the world side and the main world. With his escape route prepared, Saul could search for Byron with peace of mind. At this time, the source of the aura Saul had just detected approached. It was only a first-rank wizard. The opponent wasn't very strong, but Saul saw that there was actually a red worm lying on this wizard's shoulder. Kismet said that red worms don't have the ability to control others' consciousness. So do these people carrying red worms know that there's a monster from beyond the Stargate on their bodies? The first-rank wizard carrying the red worm walked to the world side exit. His lips moved slightly as he silently recited an incantation. After a moment, his entire figure twisted, shrank, and finally disappeared. It seems this incantation is the normal way to enter and exit the world side. However, I found the precise entrance through fate lines, so I don't need to activate the incantation and can squeeze in directly. After watching the person leave, Saul left his hiding spot behind the red worm and explored in the direction the first-rank wizard had come from. Passing through a patch of muddled red worms, he finally saw several gray spheres floating in midair. These spheres had a texture like rubber balloons, similar to the balloons on airships. Each sphere was as large as a small house. Each sphere had magical power fluctuations emanating from within. Could these spheres be the houses of this world? Because he was approaching an area where people were present, Saul stopped using flight magic. He chose a direction, ended his flight spell, and his body slowly descended. After stopping the flight spell, Saul discovered that gravity here was very weak. That bit of gravity was almost offset by air resistance. The situation of rapid falling didn't occur. Saul didn't even need to transform his arms into wings to control direction. After a while, he landed on the first balloon. The entire balloon was grayish-white. Saul carefully crawled around the balloon in a circle before discovering that the entire balloon only had one transparent spot, like a window for observation. Saul carefully looked inside through the window and saw a person tied to a pillar. The pillar was located in the center of the balloon, connecting the two ends. The tied person's head hung low. From the weak magic power and mental power emanating from their body, it could be seen that their condition wasn't very good. They might even die at any moment. Saul had never seen this wizard before, and could only tell that the other party was a second-rank wizard. Moreover, this wizard also had no red worm on them. Someone else flew over from the distance. Saul carefully crawled to the other side of the ball, avoiding these people's line of sight. After the people left, Saul continued investigating the other balloons. Each balloon contained a person inside. Some were on death's door, some were still in relatively good spirits, but none of these people had red worms on them. Instead, those people flying around outside each had a red worm hanging on them. The positions varied on shoulders, heads, arms, even feet could have red worms hanging from them. According to Saul's covert observations, these people's mental states and consciousness were all clear, which meant these red worms, as Kismet had said, indeed didn't affect these people's consciousness and senses. People with worms stay outside, while people without worms are locked in balloons. Could this world have been invaded and occupied by worms? None of these balloons contained Byron's figure, so Saul continued flying in the direction those people had come from. After passing through another layer of floating red worms, Saul saw new balloons. There was only one balloon, but this balloon was incredibly huge. If the previous balloons were like small houses, then this one was like a 60-story skyscraper. Around this magnificent balloon floated numerous red worms, all motionless. The small ones were only palm-sized, while the large ones were 10 meters long. However, none could compare in size to the one hanging outside the Star Observatory Tower. Just then, Saul finally discovered familiar mental power again. Byron was inside the giant balloon ahead. But what Saul found strange was that Byron seemed to be moving rapidly and moving toward him. Chapter 963, Alex's Viewpoint. Ordinary people couldn't see these red worms, nor could they see Saul, who had blended with the background. And those who could see the worms would overlook Saul hiding behind them due to the extremely eye-catching red worms. Soon Byron's figure appeared, and coming with him were two other wizards, both first-rank wizards. Including Byron, all three had red worms on them. However, the two first-rank wizards carried worms no larger than an arm, while the worm on Byron was particularly massive, nearly 2 meters tall, already exceeding his height. The worm lay on his back, and from a distance it looked like he was carrying a huge pack. Saul had also seen other second-rank wizards just now, and none of them had worms on their bodies that could compare in size to the one on Byron. Looking at their formation of movement, Byron seemed to still be the leader of this small team. Has Senior infiltrated the enemy camp and already become a leader? Why is the worm on him so big? Saul felt that Byron didn't seem to need his rescue. Saul tugged at the fate line belonging to Byron within his soul body. Byron, who had originally been hurrying along, suddenly stopped. "What's wrong, sir?" Byron's eyes moved slightly. You go execute the mission first. I need to check on the condition of other test subjects. The two first-rank wizards following Byron didn't notice anything unusual, nodded and left first. Byron then flew toward the direction Saul had come from, stopped halfway, looked around. Temporarily, no other people were approaching. "Are you nearby?" Byron asked in a small voice, so quiet it barely carried 2 meters away. But Saul, who had been paying attention to Byron all along, still heard it. One of his hands instantly transformed into an octopus tentacle, lightly flicked out, wrapped around Byron, and pulled him behind the red worm where he was hiding. "Senior, Agu and I were worried about you, but it turns out you've already become a leader here." Saul looked at Byron with amusement, especially staring at the giant red worm on Byron's back for several glances. Although few wizards could see red worms along the way, Byron didn't doubt at all that Saul could see them. To defeat the enemy, you must first understand the enemy. Seeing Saul again after a year, Byron was also happy, but his facial expression remained mild. "I just gained the right to leave and was planning to find Agu this time. I didn't expect you'd already found your way in." So Byron still regarded the Stargate Council as enemies. "What did they capture you to do? I saw wizards tied up in those balloons over there, while you free people all have worms on you. You can see the worms, right?" Byron nodded. "Actually, for the Stargate Council, both we and those imprisoned test subjects are their experimental objects. The data they want to test is actually—" "Let me tell Wizard Saul instead." Suddenly a voice rang out, startling both Saul and Byron. Although they heard another person's voice, they still couldn't detect the voice's owner, yet that voice was clearly right beside them. Just as Saul was looking left and right, the 3-meter-long red worm in front of him suddenly split open a gap from its belly. A thin, middle-aged man actually walked out from the belly of the red worm that others couldn't touch. This man had dark skin and brown hair mixed with some silver threads. He looked like he was in his 50s or 60s, but his skin was as smooth as a peeled egg. "Chairman Alec." Byron pulled Saul and called out the other party's identity in front of him. Chairman Alec of the Stargate Council looked somewhat different from the rumors described. He ranked first in strength among the publicly known fourth-rank wizards, but rarely participated in combat, with his energy basically devoted to research. Seeing Chairman Alec suddenly appear before him, Saul's first reaction wasn't that he had been caught sneaking in again, but rather he asked in surprise, "These red worms can't be touched through mental power or magic power. How did you hide inside and come out?" Alec smiled, and that face that looked harsh showed no signs of anger. "Previously Murich invited you to join the Stargate experiments, but you didn't agree. Now you come asking me," he said jokingly. "Then I won't tell you casually." So the Stargate Council chairman had this kind of personality. For some reason, this kind of Alec made people want to trust him from the bottom of their hearts. Saul suspected he was under the influence of the other party's magic power, but when he checked his soul body, there was no other force acting upon it. So it was natural charisma. "Just kidding." The other party was indeed joking. "The Stargate welcomes you to join our experimental research at any time." Alec first said to Byron, "You still have a mission. Regardless of your purpose for joining the experiment, first complete your current task seriously. Find the newest release on N0 Vel Fire, small cap NET." Byron pressed his lips together, looked at Saul with concern, but thinking that staying here wouldn't help, he gave him a meaningful look and turned to leave, going to find the previous first-rank wizards. Saul awkwardly touched his chin. "So you guessed I would sneak in?" "No need to guess." Alex snapped his fingers, and the two suddenly moved from among a pile of worms to a room full of experimental equipment. "This world side has never been defended. Whoever can find the entrance can come in. I also don't need to send people to patrol or guard. I believe that people who see the Stargate experiments will ultimately choose to join, just like your friend and your future self. This Chairman Alec was quite confident. Your current attitude contradicts Murich and the others' actions of catching people outside. Saul spoke quite boldly. That was Murich's doing. Before the Stargate Council completely leaves the wizard world and enters star travel, we still need the stability of grassroots society to provide sufficient materials and personnel. If we announce the red worm matter, the productivity of panic-stricken cities would be greatly reduced. So we ultimately chose to conduct experiments in secret. However, wizards like you, who can find their own way and won't choose to announce the red worm secret to the outside world, even if they know about it. Alec was right about this point. Although Saul had snuck in to rescue someone, he had no intention of announcing the existence of red worms to ordinary people. First, red worms wouldn't attack people without magic power. In those worms' view, people without magical talent were like pebbles on the roadside. They could casually step on them but wouldn't deliberately step on them. And for wizards who couldn't see or touch the worms, how would you explain to make them believe that red worms really existed? What about after you enter star travel? By that time, the world will also be about to be destroyed by the black tide. Those left behind will either find new ways to survive under extremely small probability or perish together with the world. Whether they know the truth or not is meaningless. Chapter 964, Deactivation. One of them seemed to be an anti-pollution experiment. It was identical to the equipment Saul had used when doing therapeutic research. Lord Alec, these instruments are all used to protect against starlight pollution, right? If they can resist starlight pollution, they can resist black tide pollution. Do you really think leaving is safer than staying? The starry sky isn't entirely dangerous. If we can find a suitable world, it can become the new base for the Stargate Council. I understand, Saul nodded. When Alec explained to Saul, his tone was calm, but this very calmness meant his decision wouldn't change. Similarly, Saul's expression told Alec that he wouldn't participate in the Stargate's escape plan. Alec understood, then we won't interfere with each other. I want to take Senior Byron away. He's already passed the test. The Stargate won't interfere with his actions. For all those who pass the test, the Stargate won't force them to leave or stay. If they don't leave willingly, they'd instead become a burden to the Stargate. Oh, by the way, he needs to complete the mission he's already accepted. No problem, Saul naturally agreed. If Byron had any issues, he could still help. Saul looked through the transparent window of the balloon room at the red worms floating in the air, thinking that since the atmosphere was so good, why not make another deal? Chairman Alec, are these red worms that have already died? I don't yet have a way to accurately define their life and death, since I have limited understanding of their life form. However, Alec raised his hand and took out a half-meter-long worm. This red worm was the same as the worms floating outside. No matter how Alec touched or kneaded it, it remained completely motionless. They may not be dead yet, but they no longer respond to external stimuli. I've named this state deactivation. Deactivated red worms are more stable. As long as you can see it and be aware of its existence, you can use its power. It could be said they are an idealistic existence. An idealistic existence. This overturns my understanding of magic. Saul reached out trying to touch the red worm, but only felt air. Yet Alec beside him was still gripping the red worm's shell with his hand. Did you use some special power to touch it? Alec shook his head. Think again. Was it because of idealistic power? Saul raised his hand again. When his finger was about to touch the red worm, he told himself in his mind, I can do it, I can touch it. His finger continued approaching then. Still touched nothing. Alec smiled. It seems you need more psychological preparation. Simply telling yourself it exists isn't enough. Saul was now truly interested in red worms. They could be said to be a species outside the two power systems of magic and mental power. Moreover, thinking of this red worm's concealment ability and its ability to resist the black tide, Saul made up his mind. Do these deactivated worms have any other uses for the Stargate Council? The deactivated red worms scattered everywhere like garbage in the hidden world side looked like waste products that couldn't be processed. Alec carefully examined Saul. You want these deactivated worms? Actually, I want both deactivated and non-deactivated ones, but I can't control non-deactivated worms yet. If I find a method, I might just go outside and catch some directly. What would you trade for them? Alec asked without courtesy. Saul crossed his arms, thinking, since they're thrown around here in such large quantities, they must not be very useful. I won't rush to play my trump card. He took out a magic notebook from his spatial nameplate and held it in his hand. You know, I have some insights into treating black tide pollution. This is a formation that can make black tide lose its polluting ability within a certain range. I call it the inertization formula. Deactivation, inertization, it seems our ultimate goals are consistent. Alec pulled another half-meter-long deactivated red worm in front of Saul. I agree to this trade. However, can you take it away? If it's inconvenient, you can also research here. I'll reserve several laboratories for you. Is this leaving Senior Byron behind, then trying to use an excuse to keep me here too? Saul looked at the red worm in front of him. It had to be said, Alec was quite good at business. He wanted to use interests and desires to bind people. However, Saul didn't speak, but suddenly raised his hand to grab the red worm's mouthparts, pulled it in front of him and shook it twice. The motionless red worm swayed with Saul's force and wasn't shaken off. Saul raised his head and met Alec's surprised gaze. No need to prepare a laboratory for me. I've already grabbed it. Alec slowly narrowed his eyes, revealing an ambiguous smile. You learn quickly. In some ways, you're really similar to Gorsa. Too bad he's already died in the Abyssal Eye. Otherwise, I'd really like to see the day you surpass him. Saul lowered his eyes and said calmly, I've always believed my master will return. The scrutinizing gaze didn't disappear until Saul left the Stargate's hidden world side. Saul emptied his mind, letting himself think of nothing, and carried the dead fish-like dead worm back to the Star Observatory Tower. At this time there were other people on this floor, but although they saw Saul, they had no reaction. As if confirming Alec's words, the Stargate Council currently had no checkpoints set up. Everyone who joined their experiments did so voluntarily for their own interests. But was this really the case? Saul was in no hurry to draw conclusions. After coming out of the Stargate world side, he sensed Byron's location. His senior hadn't gone far, just a few floors below the Star Observatory Tower. This time Saul didn't hide his magic power fluctuations and leisurely walked back to ground level. At this moment, he had one hand in his pocket and the other carrying the red worm he just traded for. I'll go find a living worm later and compare them to see the differences. It would be best if I could analyze what the Stargate obtained during the red worm deactivation process. Alec hadn't told Saul the method for deactivating red worms. This was obviously the experiment the Stargate Council currently valued most, and the most valuable part of this experiment was what was extracted from the worms during the transition from alive to dead. Saul walked outside the Star Observatory Tower, waiting for Byron to complete his mission and come find him. But he didn't wait for Byron. Instead, he waited for someone else. Saul, how do you appear and disappear like a ghost? Jeffrey called out to Saul and walked over with an excited expression. I passed the initial selection, but they said I still need to follow true wizards for training. Only after passing the training can I officially join the Stargate Council? Jeffrey looked proud. He excitedly asked Saul, "What about you?" Saul had an indifferent smile on his face. "I probably can't join the Stargate Council." Jeffrey was somewhat happy but had to carefully restrain his happiness. He consoled Saul, "It's okay. Even if you can't join the Stargate, you can try staying in Olga Duchy. Because the Stargate headquarters is nearby, the research atmosphere here is still very strong. If you stay here, your probability of advancing to third-level Wizard Apprentice is definitely higher than returning to Stat Continent." After Jeffrey was called away by others, the Silver Butterfly mocked, "Brother Saul, you were consoled by someone. Strange, can't he tell that your magic power fluctuations are wrong?" Saul looked at Jeffrey's retreating figure. "It is a bit strange." He narrowed his eyes and focused on observing Jeffrey's back. Finally, Saul saw a hint of red at Jeffrey's collar. There was a thumb-sized red worm on his neck. Looking carefully, that red worm should be longer than a thumb, but Saul couldn't analyze exactly how long. Because the worm's head had already burrowed under Jeffrey's skin, and he didn't know how deep it was buried. Chapter 965, The Half-Elf's Request. Saul wanted to call Jeffrey back to see if he had already been affected by the red worms, or to see if the current Jeffrey was still the wizard apprentice he had met at the airport. But under Alec's watchful eye, Saul chose not to act rashly. The Stargate Council could tolerate Saul going in for a look around, but wouldn't allow Saul to sabotage their experiments. Not even just one sample from their experiments. Saul looked away and continued waiting for Byron. He raised his left hand, looking at the deactivated red worm in his hand, and asked the consciousness bodies in the diary, "What do you think this species resembles?" "Like Veil soul crystals." Penny was the first to answer. "I haven't eaten Veil soul crystals in so long." "It is similar indeed, but there's still a big difference from real hidden crystals." "Beth, Saul, how did you manage to touch this red worm?" Clearly little Algae and Nightmare Butterfly, who had consciousness attributes, had both failed to make contact, yet Saul had grasped the red worm after just 2 attempts. Penny and little Algae made contact with non-deactivated red worms, which is different from my current situation. These deactivated ones are easier to contact, but the prerequisite is that you must acknowledge their existence. "Let me try first." Penny couldn't sit still anymore and directly came out of the diary, pouncing toward the worm. But like Saul's first attempt, she pounced at nothing. "Strange, why can't I touch it?" I was clearly telling myself in my mind that it could be touched. Saul shared his method. Don't emphasize it in your mind. The more you emphasize, the more it means you don't completely believe it in your heart and need repeated suggestions to hypnotize yourself. This makes it even more impossible to touch the red worm. Only by subconsciously acknowledging the worm's existence can you make contact with it. Saul pinched the deactivated red worm with 2 fingers and opened his hand for Penny to see. "Actually, I took a shortcut. Otherwise, I'd need more time to adapt before I could touch red worms." There was a half-closed star-shaped eye in his palm. The star-shaped eye that had once fought back and forth with red worms immediately lost interest after discovering the red worm in Saul's hand was deactivated. Although it wasn't completely closed, it also didn't bother with the dead worm anymore. Seeing the star-shaped eye, Penny retreated behind Saul's head in fright. Saul closed his fingers, covering the half-open star-shaped eye. In front of the deactivated red worm, the star-shaped eye held absolute advantage. Saul suspected that death demons, whose basic ability was observation, could see all things that existed in various senses. Red worms seemed to exist only in consciousness, but as long as consciousness could be seen, then star-shaped eyes could see it. If star-shaped eyes could see it, then for them it existed and could be influenced. Therefore, when Saul used the star-shaped eye's ability, the red worm he gazed upon could be grasped by him. If I'm not wrong, I can also try to catch a non-deactivated red worm through this method. But the problem is that star-shaped eyes can't be maintained for too long. Otherwise, they'll also cause pollution to the surrounding environment. Although the pollution caused by star-shaped eyes didn't have strong offensive power yet, their bizarre attributes were already maxed out. Saul strongly suspected that if he ever lost control of the star-shaped eyes and let them run wild, this wizard world would instantly gain hundreds or thousands of star-shaped eye aggregates. Thinking about the star-shaped eye problem, Saul finally waited for Byron to come out. "Saul, why did you get a deactivated worm?" Byron first saw Saul, then immediately noticed the red worm in Saul's hand. Saul raised the worm in his hand. "Senior, can you touch it?" Byron naturally touched the red worm. "Yes. After all, I'm carrying one on my back. Although it has no weight, I can clearly feel it lying on my back against the top of my head." Byron indeed knew there was a worm on him. Saul was somewhat worried. "Does the worm on you affect your consciousness? I once saw Wizard Corey, who also had a red worm on her shoulder. Although it was smaller, I noticed her consciousness seemed somewhat blurred." Byron nodded seriously. "I guess some reasons. Let's go back and talk." "Go where?" "Agu and I rented a house in the capital of Olga Duchy, not far from here. Through the window, you can normally see the Star Observatory Tower. Initially, I was researching the Stargate Council's movements from there." Agu explained in the diary. "After Wizard Byron was taken away, I was afraid they would trace our registered address, so I never went back." Saul understood. "Now that we've cleared things up, let's go back and talk. By the way, did you set up a laboratory in that rental house?" Byron nodded. "Standard equipment." Laboratories were basically a necessity for every wizard. Even rooms rented to wizards would be equipped with rooms with good privacy for experiments. After following Byron back, Saul discovered that the area he rented was a housing complex specifically for wizards. Each house was an independent small villa, and the houses were separated by walls inscribed with magical formations. As the two were about to enter the villa's courtyard, someone suddenly called out to Byron. "Wizard Byron, long time no see, you're finally back." A middle-aged man stood at the door of the neighboring villa, smiling as he greeted Byron. Byron only responded with a "him," and the other party seemed used to it and wasn't offended. Saul glanced at Byron's neighbor, feeling like he had seen him somewhere before. But he was absolutely certain that whether it was the other party's mental power or magic power fluctuations, they were unfamiliar to him. The two entered the house. Byron led Saul to the laboratory. On the way, Saul couldn't help asking, "Senior, who was that third-rank wizard who greeted you just now? Why do I feel like I've seen him somewhere?" "You mean Wizard Douglas just now? You shouldn't have met him. He was already living here before I came. According to the landlord, he's been living here for 3 or 4 years." "A third-rank wizard has been living in Olga Duchy for 3 or 4 years. Then I shouldn't have met him. Strange. Why do I feel inexplicably familiar?" Saul thought for a long time but couldn't remember where he had seen this Wizard Douglas. He had to give up for now and continue asking Byron about the red worm on him. Byron didn't turn around until they entered the laboratory and activated the magical formation that isolated information leakage. He said to Saul, who had already started fiddling with the experimental table, "I'm carrying such a big worm mainly because the half-elf wants it." "Oh, I understand." At the end, Byron suddenly started talking to himself. But Saul had already guessed that the half-elf inside Byron had probably awakened. "Let me speak with you instead." Byron's temperament instantly underwent a complete transformation, and a vague face faintly appeared near Byron's right ear. "What you're holding in your hand, and what Byron is carrying, are very good containers for elves and half-elves whose consciousness worlds have been distorted. So I request Wizard Byron to help me cultivate containers suitable for elves to inhabit. Chapter 966. Step Inside. Although the elf granted Byron powerful mental power and charisma, that was hard to say whether it was useful or not. Once Byron overused the elf, he would be pulled into the world's crevices, his soul gradually becoming chaotic, and finally mixing with the elf's soul body of a different race into a chaotic mass. This was simply a ticking time bomb. I can help you make a container that can hold you, but the prerequisite is that I need to thoroughly analyze the red worm situation. They might come in handy during black tide pollution. Saul wouldn't refuse the half-elf, but he also wouldn't give the half-elf freedom for nothing. To want freedom, one naturally had to work hard for it. Wizards believed in equivalent exchange, didn't they? You're now also a special type of consciousness body, and you can discover the red worm's special properties, so let's research together. Only the more we understand about red worms can we create more suitable containers. The half-elf nodded. I will cooperate with all your experiments through Byron's mouth and his body. The half-elf's blurred face slowly retreated under Byron's skin, revealing Byron's wooden expression again. Saul said helplessly, "You suddenly wanted to come to the Stargate Council to help the half-elf create suitable containers." Byron didn't deny it. They live in the interlayer of the world barrier. Only the half-elf can barely communicate with the outside world through me. But precisely because they live within the world barrier, they're very sensitive to invasions by external species. My ability to see red worms actually relies on the half-elf's enhancement. Byron pointed to the giant worm on his body. I was able to raise the worm on me to this size, thanks to the half-elf's feeding. What could Saul say but sigh? Didn't Chairman Alec research why the red worm on you is so big? He said it might be related to each person's mental power. Byron walked around Saul in a circle. Why are you so clean? You mean I don't have a worm on me? Byron nodded. Everyone who can see worms has a worm on them. Even Chairman Alec is no exception. He just seems to have hidden his worm through some method. He only takes it out occasionally when he needs to research. Saul recalled the scene of Alec's appearance and looked up at the room ceiling. He can come out from inside worms. He can also touch red worms very naturally, which definitely isn't as simple as just hypnotizing himself that red worms really exist. I suspect he may have already begun modifying himself. Byron shook his head repeatedly. A species that just appeared. We haven't even researched its basic properties clearly. How could he use it to modify himself? Maybe it's confidence, or maybe it's lack of confidence. Saul put Alec's matter aside for now. Let's first try to catch a few live red worms. As for the one on you, it should be a container the half-elf prepared for himself. I'll wait until I'm confident before touching it. Although he had obtained some information about red worms from both Kismet and Byron, to transform this information into reliable data for experiments still required Saul to personally conduct testing and research. These things couldn't be done by others. However, after circling around the Star Observatory Tower for 3 days, Saul hadn't seen a single red worm, leading him to suspect whether Alec had collected all the other worms to make him go to the world's side to research red worms. Saul walked aimlessly on the small roads of Alga's capital. He wasn't strolling, but searching for red worms that hadn't been taken away by the Stargate Council yet. Red worms didn't like ordinary people, and would only devour wizards or inhabit wizards who could see red worms. So for these 3 days, Saul had wandered around Alga's wizard-gathering areas. Penny fell from high altitude and landed on Saul's shoulder, weakly drooping her antennae. Can't see any trace of red worms at all. So strange, when we want to find them, we can't find them no matter what. Saul had already calmed down from the doubts and anxiety of the previous 2 days, The worms in this area might have all been collected by the Stargate Council, but it doesn't matter. In a couple days we'll go outside. I've already guessed where there will be red worms. Why in a couple days? Penny didn't understand. Byron went to the Stargate to mooch knowledge again, and we have nothing to do here. Let's go now. I'm still waiting for someone. Saul walked through Alga streets. Who? Me? You little butterfly haven't been eaten by anyone yet. Kismet suddenly flipped out from the top of an alley wall. Seeing Kismet, Penny immediately retreated into Saul's brow. It had psychological trauma regarding Kismet. Are you following me? Saul wasn't afraid of Kismet. He was wondering how he and Penny had just mentioned Kismet when this guy appeared. Coincidences couldn't be this coincidental every time, right? Kismet grinned. I did come a while ago. Just waiting for you to mention me before popping out. How interesting. You've become much more lively after getting back your soul fragment. Looks like you've been doing well recently. Kismet looked somewhat proud, supporting his elbow with one hand and pinching his chin with the other. Things are developing fairly smoothly, so I'm in a good mood. What are you plotting again? Saul was starting to develop psychological trauma about this guy too. Don't worry, I won't harm you, my little brother master. You're coming out now, are you ready? Saul didn't believe Kismet's words at all. His words were just to listen to and not take seriously. Ultimately, he had to see what he was actually doing. Yes, we can start any time. What Saul and Kismet were discussing was determining the fifth target of Symphony of Fate. He had already completed the selection of 4 targets, so doing the fifth naturally wasn't a problem. The only special thing was that once the fifth target was determined, the 5 targets would form a pentagram closed loop, with destiny forces influencing each other. They would prosper together. If one party encountered danger, the other 4 could provide excess destiny force to help them overcome difficulties. And these 5 targets all had direct connections to Saul. Most of the destiny force would also be provided to Saul. After Symphony of Fate was officially completed, Saul could advance to 4th rank at any time. He wouldn't even need extra preparation. So when Saul and Kismet came to the wilderness area on the side of Alga's capital far from the Star Observatory Tower, Saul was still very excited inside. Besides the 2 of them, no other people passed by the area, only some wild beasts, insects, and birds. This time, the target of Symphony of Fate personally helped Saul arrange the auxiliary formation. Kismet seemed as excited as Saul, though his emotions might be more curiosity. While arranging, Kismet relied on his knowledge and learning to roughly understand the characteristics of Saul's advancement method, which made Kismet somewhat surprised. No, not somewhat surprised, quite surprised. You've changed the very essence of death weaving. Kismet looked at the main formation on the ground that Saul had personally drawn. I initially thought you just stopped controlling the target's life and death, but now I discover that the power operating your formation has nothing to do with death force at all. Saul straightened his back and made a final check, pointing with his chin toward the center of the formation. Enough chatter, step inside. Chapter 967, Failure. Saul made one final check, confirming that Kismet hadn't tampered with anything inside, then took out magic crystals and placed them in the energy-providing auxiliary formation. At the same time, a black, slender vine-like tentacle extended from the back of his neck. Circling around the auxiliary formation and central formation, it grew and spread bit by bit, enclosing the formation along with both Kismet and Saul inside. Little algae drew a circle on the ground, continuing to grow upward, interlacing and climbing, finally forming a black protective cover. Kismet looked at the starlight seeping through the gaps in the vines overhead. Are you afraid of someone ambushing us, or afraid of others seeing your formation? Saul had already walked to his position, slightly raising his hands and bringing them around to his chest. This magical light and shadow is quite obvious, but it's fast. Having little algae conceal our forms is also to buy us some time. This time Saul hadn't established a good relationship with local forces. To prevent outsiders from suddenly appearing and unconsciously disrupting his magical formation, Saul decided to be more cautious. After Saul finished speaking, the formation runes under his feet lit up one by one, like sparks starting a prairie fire, gradually spreading. Standing at the other end of the formation, Kismet stared unblinkingly at the changes in the formation below his feet and the magic power circulation above. This power was too special. He had never seen it before and didn't even know how Saul had mastered it. He had clearly been monitoring Saul's movements all along, yet the other party seemed to have suddenly learned this magical power in a dream and wielded it with ease, as if he had mastered this power many years ago. From the first time he met Saul, Kismet felt this guy was extremely mysterious, like book pages that could never be turned to the end, always having unknown plot points waiting to be revealed. So even after getting back his soul fragment, Kismet still called Saul master. The most important reason was that this guy could always arouse his curiosity. He seemed to have an unpredictable fate. Until the very last moment, no one could know the answer. Kismet liked the unknown, because from very, very early on, everything about him had already been arranged by others. Whether it was being imprisoned in a feather pen, or after escaping and creating pages of dead wizard's diary around the world, or even welcoming each new owner of the diary and testing their abilities. All of this had been fixed in his body and consciousness very, very long ago. And all he could do was add a bit of his own malicious humor to this predetermined fate. Hundreds of years had passed in a flash, each day seeming different yet monotonously the same. Until in a small manor whose name he couldn't even remember, Kismet met the diary's newest owner. He suddenly discovered this guy seemed somewhat interesting. Focus! Saul noticed Kismet looking down at his feet, seemingly distracted, and quickly shouted. Kismet lifted his eyelids, revealing a confident smile. "Don't worry, my little brother master. I'll definitely cooperate fully." Saul said no more. The formation had officially started. The next second, a red light shot up from the ground, and after being filtered once by little algae, scattered red light rays projected toward the sky. The 5 auxiliary formations immediately lit up with the same red glow, though their light columns were somewhat thinner. 5 red lights simultaneously rose to the sky, then simultaneously twisted midway, turning toward Kismet. The magic crystals placed on the magical formation melted rapidly like ice and snow in fire. To ensure the formation's stability, Saul continuously channeled magic power into the formation. Saul raised his head, staring at Kismet, the most important character in the center of the formation. Once all the red light columns converged on him, Saul would immediately mobilize fate power to establish a connection with Kismet, transmit this power to the other 4 target figures, and simultaneously extract equivalent power from the other 4 targets to establish it on Kismet. After confirming that everyone's destiny force could mutually transmit and feedback to each other, Saul's complex symphony of fate that had taken years to establish would be completely finished. However, the next second, Saul watched helplessly as the 5 red light columns directly penetrated through Kismet's body and fell onto the ground behind him. As if Kismet wasn't standing in the formation at all, or as if it simply couldn't sense any destiny on Kismet. Unable to find a target for destiny connection, the light columns automatically disappeared after falling into the earth. Subsequently, the magical formation under Saul's feet gradually dimmed. Only the half-melted magic crystals on the ground could tell people what had once occurred. Little algae silently withdrew, sensing the somewhat oppressive atmosphere and quickly burrowing back into Saul's neck. Kismet looked down at his chest, then looked up at Saul. All the worldly cynicism and frivolous smile on his face had disappeared, looking somewhat bewildered. "Little brother master, did you fail in the operation?" Saul was also somewhat puzzled. The red light all started normally, which means there were no problems with my magic power operation. This was the first time Saul had encountered target binding failure. Although he said there were no problems, he had already begun circling around the several magical formations to check. He needed to determine which step had encountered conflict. But after checking around, Saul still hadn't found where his calculations had gone wrong. Finally, he could only approach Kismet. At the beginning, Saul had seen a slight bewilderment revealed on Kismet's face, which had now disappeared. There was also no cunning smile showing. This shouldn't be Kismet playing tricks. The mental fluctuations and emotions the other party had just displayed were surprise and disappointment. Someone who can't be chosen by fate lines. Could Kismet have other secrets? No matter how much he thought about it, it was useless. Saul walked in front of Kismet. "I need to confirm first, did you resist?" Kismet slowly shook his head. For some reason, this serious and earnest Kismet made Saul feel very uncomfortable. "Then it seems there's a problem with you. Maybe you're not compatible with the power of fate." Saul first sought Kismet's opinion. "Before trying again, I need to check your physical condition. Is that okay?" Wizards weren't the type to give up easily. Experimental failure wasn't anything unusual. Saul quickly entered the process of retracing experimental steps and error correction. But for some reason, Kismet raised his hand to block between Saul and himself. His movements were somewhat stiff, with no expression on his face. "No need," he said. "I know what's going on, so no need." He gave no explanation and turned to leave. Just after taking his second step, Kismet's figure disappeared, as if he couldn't stay there for another moment. "Brother Saul, he's so strange." Penny took the opportunity to run out again. "But seeing this guy show such an expression still makes me very happy. Ha ha ha." Penny laughed heartlessly. But Saul didn't feel the refreshing satisfaction of seeing Kismet's misfortune. After realizing the problem might be with him, the other party's emotions instantly plummeted and could even be said to be painful. Although Kismet had tried his best to hide it, Saul had already figured out his temperament. The other party was someone connected to the diary, and not as simple as an ordinary black page consciousness body. Was his inability to become Saul's fifth target also related to the diary? Was someone who couldn't accept fate lines because he had no fate line of his own? Chapter 968, Douglas's Experimental Invitation. But he wasn't in a hurry to leave this place. Saul jumped onto a large tree, found a sturdy trunk, and sat down leaning against the main trunk. He raised his hand, and the diary appeared in his palm. The dark red hardcover book floated quietly as usual. But when Saul's thoughts stirred slightly, the hardcover book automatically opened, pages rustling as they turned from the golden first page all the way to the last black page. Saul stared at this diary turning from beginning to end, but didn't discover the slightest connection related to Kismet. When Kismet's soul fragment was hidden in the diary, I discovered it right when the diary first acknowledged me as master. That soul fragment was also indeed completely returned to Kismet, with no residue whatsoever. But why can't the fate lines on Kismet accept the connection of Symphony of Fate? Kismet hadn't let Saul examine his body, causing Saul to only be able to guess blindly at many places during his current review. Although there was no evidence, Saul always felt that what happened to Kismet was related to the diary. He closed the diary. "If Kismet won't work, I can only switch to another target. Should I consider the half-elf?" After thinking for a moment, Saul abandoned this idea. Elves were ultimately different from other races. His current foundation was still in this wizard world, and elves had already been erased by the world's consciousness. Connecting fate lines with elves would be opposing the entire world's will. This would be equivalent to hindering his own development, more loss than gain. However, he could still help the elves in other ways. After all, besides separating Byron from the elf, Saul was also very interested in some characteristics displayed by the half-elf. Now he had also discovered that the half-elf could not only see red worms, but seemed to be able to control red worms, which was too useful. With the fifth target failing, Saul temporarily had no other targets and could only return to Byron's rented house first. But before he could enter, he saw Douglas, who had just come out from next door. During these days of coming and going at Byron's place, Saul had also seen Douglas once, though he hadn't initiated conversation. The other party had no red worms on him, and Saul currently had no mood to discuss academic knowledge with other wizards. When the two met, they would just glance at each other, not even nodding. However, this time Douglas actively called out to Saul. "Hello there, are you also helping the Stargate Council research red worms?" Saul's steps toward entering the house paused. He turned back to look at this man emanating third-rank wizard mental power fluctuations. "Hello, Mr. Douglas. So you also know about red worms?" Knowing about red worms but having no red worms on him. Among those Saul knew, including himself, there were 4 people, and now Douglas made 5. Saul was immediately in no hurry to go back. He walked down from the porch steps and came to the low fence between the 2 villas. Actually, people like us aren't rare, but there aren't many who haven't been persuaded by Chairman Alec. Douglas rested one hand on the fence. "I initially thought you had also joined the Stargate Council's research, but recently I discovered you don't seem to be in cahoots with them." "I don't think highly of their plan," Saul shrugged. "Indeed." Douglas lowered his head, his expression unclear. "When you're young, you always think home isn't good. Only after going outside do you realize how vicious the world can be." Saul's eyes flickered slightly, then quickly returned to normal. "I'm the same." Saul followed Douglas's words. "If we can't even protect our own world, even if we go outside, it's a dead end." "Then it seems our views are consistent." Douglas smiled with satisfaction, but quickly turned to sighing. "Unfortunately, the Stargate Council appears open but is actually domineering. They simply won't listen to other people's ideas." "So he has ideas." Saul believed that Douglas suddenly appearing when he returned and actively striking up conversation was definitely not because he really wanted to complain to him about the domineering Stargate Council. So now he should reveal some real purpose, right? However, Douglas didn't recklessly discuss his ideas outside. He invited Saul to his home to continue their exchange. Saul readily agreed. Douglas's house was the same as Byron's, with multiple layers of isolation facilities to prevent outsiders from spying on internal information through magic or other means. Following Douglas into the neighboring house and then underground, seeing what was in the room, Saul asked somewhat unexpectedly, "You're secretly conducting red worm experiments?" It turned out Douglas had set up a special laboratory in the basement. Here gravity was nullified, and almost everything was fixed to the walls. The only things not fixed were red worms. There were 3 red worms in the room, not large in volume. The longest was only about 1 meter. These 3 red worms all floated quietly in the air. Saul quickly recognized that these were all deactivated red worms. Saul flew around the red worms in a circle and found they were the same as the one Alec had given him. This at least showed that Douglas already possessed the same ability as the Stargate Council to create deactivated red worms. Considering that the other party might only have 1 or a few people, Saul once again realized that the person before him was truly a very capable third-rank wizard. When the other party mentioned the Stargate Council just now, the disdain in his words made Saul vaguely feel the other party wasn't simple. That's why he was willing to exchange more with him and follow him into the laboratory. He felt he might be able to obtain some useful inspiration or information from Douglas, but he didn't expect to directly see experimental results. Saul couldn't help but turn back to look at Douglas at the door. "Mr. Douglas, you actually caught up with the research results of hundreds of people from the Stargate Council with your own strength. That's really amazing." Douglas just smiled lightly, not looking particularly proud. "I have two companions. This is the result of our joint efforts." "Oh, where are your companions now? I can hardly wait to discuss these magical species from the outside world with you all," Saul asked eagerly. "I'm afraid that's not possible recently. After researching deactivated red worms, our experiments hit a bottleneck. The two of them went separately to seek breakthroughs. Without new ideas, they probably won't return in the short term." "I see, but seeing such impressive experimental results is still exciting. I've just started looking for methods to create deactivated red worms myself. These days I've been going outside to find live red worms. I didn't expect that I've just started while you've already reached the finish line." Saul was completely generous with his praise. "This hardly counts as a finish line." Douglas remained calm. "Although we obtained deactivated red worms, we haven't found suitable methods to control them." Douglas spread his hands toward Saul. "We've been stuck at this step for a long time. The reason I boldly called out to you is also to see if you have any new ideas. After all, we all want to find methods to counter the Abyssal Eye by researching these powerful red worms from the outside world." Chapter 969, Useful. Byron, who had only returned from the Star Observatory Tower late at night, was so surprised his mouth fell open after hearing Saul describe what happened when he met Douglas today. "Yes," Saul rubbed his fingertips, "on this point he and I thought alike. But Saul thought of using red worms to counter the Abyssal Eye, because they could also harm star-shaped eyes." "How did Douglas think of this point?" "He said if I can find a way to control red worms, he's willing to share the formula for creating deactivated red worms with me." "It's a bit too coincidental." Byron sat across from Saul with a serious expression. "We were just thinking about turning red worms into shells for the half-elf, and Douglas proposed a cooperation plan that hits right at our target." "Yes," Saul continued nodding, "so I suspect he might know what we're planning to do. For this, he didn't hesitate to first show me his capabilities." "Do you think his cooperation with us is just to obtain methods for controlling deactivated red worms?" Byron asked Saul. "I don't think it's that simple, but I still agreed along with the flow. Our current plan for controlling deactivated red worms is through the half-elf, and this method should be difficult for others to replicate. But it's best not to let others discover the half-elf's existence." Byron was somewhat worried. If they didn't expose the half-elf, what method would they use to control red worms? That Douglas was no simple character. Saul didn't care about this point. He said with an innocent expression, "I never said the method we provide would definitely succeed, but we can completely improve it based on the situation. For example, since the half-elf is a pure soul body, we can suggest trying to use pure soul bodies to control red worms." "I understand," Byron nodded, "but what kind of pure soul body will you provide?" Saul touched his chin and said confidently, "No problem, I'm very good at creating pure soul bodies." But at this moment, Agu spoke up in the diary. "Master, rather than temporarily creating an unstable soul body, let me help you." Saul didn't want Agu to take risks, since they still weren't clear about what difficulties and dangers they might encounter when manipulating red worms. What the half-elf could do, Agu might not be able to do. But Agu had his own thoughts too. Last time when I met Fiona, she said the Stargate Council fused worms with faceless ones as materials to resist pollution, so I also want to know how exactly they did it. Faceless ones were a group that could barely protect themselves, so they rarely contacted each other. But this didn't mean he could remain indifferent after hearing that his fellow tribesmen were all being used as materials. Saul and Byron exchanged glances, both understanding Agu's intention. Saul was also very curious about this, but he couldn't guarantee that Alec would treat him the same as others, that even after participating in experiments, he could leave whenever he wanted. He believed more that the other party would use other methods to forcibly bind him to the chariot of escaping the wizard world. Even if he could escape then, he'd have to lose a layer of skin. Unless he had other bargaining chips in hand, something that could resist Alec's power and strength. Or Saul finally agreed to Agu's proposal and took him to see Douglas next door again. I've already tested the method of using soul bodies to control worms, but soul bodies can't even withstand simple pollution. How can they withstand red worms? Douglas didn't think highly of this proposal at all and immediately rejected it. At this moment, Agu voluntarily came out of the diary. Agu and Herman were authorized by Saul to freely enter and exit. Lord Douglas, I do have some resistance to pollution. Perhaps you could try. As soon as Douglas saw Agu, his eyes immediately stuck to him, looking him up and down several times. A consciousness body looks like a faceless one's consciousness body too. Really? Rare. The smile on his face already showed his attitude. Douglas turned to ask Saul, "Where did you get this consciousness body?" Saul hadn't expected the other party to immediately recognize Agu's identity. Worthy of being a wizard living an escaper. Of course, this also had to do with the current Agu not using a vessel to conceal his identity. Saul said truthfully, "This consciousness body was given to me by my master." Douglas's mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. "Since you possess such a special consciousness body, then we can try experimenting." Douglas led Saul back into his underground laboratory. Entering the laboratory, Saul discovered there was one more deactivated red worm here than last time. "Where did you get the red worm? Can you now share the method for deactivating red worms?" Of course. Douglas didn't refuse. The new red worm was obtained by killing a Stargate Council wizard. As for deactivation, it's actually very simple, just troublesome to verify. Douglas took out a notebook he had prepared long ago. Non-deactivated red worms are too autonomous and completely impossible to control, but deactivated red worms are very obedient. Saul took the notebook and looked down to flip through it, while Douglas's voice continued. Using powerful pollution to inject into red worms' bodies in an instant can temporarily deactivate them. The stronger and more pollution injected, the longer the deactivated state lasts. I'm not clear about the Stargate Council's experiments for maintaining red worm deactivation, but these 4 of mine can be maintained for 10 years without problem. So directly violent. Saul really hadn't used black tide pollution against red worms yet, but if extremely strong pollution could obtain deactivated red worms, wouldn't that be too simple for him? Saul clenched his left hand and imperceptibly rubbed his fingertip. While Saul examined the method for deactivating red worms, Douglas tested Agu's abilities. "Your aptitude is good. You can completely try controlling red worms. There's a 30% chance of success." For Douglas, a 30% chance was already quite a high probability. "I'll modify the red worms based on the data from your body, trying to improve your compatibility rate as much as possible. After you return, you also need to train according to the method I described." Agu came down from the experimental table and returned to Saul's side. I can see you value this consciousness body quite a bit, so I won't keep him. Have him adapt to pollution levels and mental power vibration methods according to what I said. When he can make contact with deactivated red worms, bring him back." Saul stood up. "Then we'll go back first." When they reached the door, Saul stopped again. "Aren't you afraid I'll take your method and run away?" Douglas laughed carelessly. "You can run away, but this continent can't." This statement was somewhat puzzling. Saul looked at him deeply and still left with Agu. After Saul left, Douglas gently closed the door. The moment he closed the door, it seemed like a light swept through the entire room. A small figure jumped down from the overhead chandelier. Upon closer look, it was Ophelia. "Do you want Saul to go to the abyss to create deactivated red worms? Are you planning to take the opportunity to kill him?" "No," Douglas said, then glanced at the restless Ophelia. "You're not allowed to touch him either." Douglas tugged at the collar of his wizard robe, slightly impatient, leaking traces of dark aura from his body, but quickly restrained it cleanly. "Him I have use for." Chapter 970. The prophetic dream appears again. He hadn't dreamed in a long time, and every time he dreamed, it seemed to have certain omens. He used to not understand why he could have prophetic dreams, but now he had guessed that those star-shaped eyes that originally belonged to him had observational abilities. This observation even included observation of the future. Now the star-shaped eyes were once again letting Saul see the future. He looked down and saw the abyssal eye beneath his feet, a huge, sunken vortex that made the ocean gradually change from azure to dark blue, then to darkness that devoured everything. The sound of seawater reaching Saul's ears seemed to pass through layers of glass. Everything was so blurred, so distant. The bottomless whirlpool beneath his feet was as remote as the starry sky overhead, making one dizzy when looking out. He should be maintaining flight magic at this moment, but the magic power in his body was precarious, as if it would fail at any moment. And once the magic power failed, he would fall toward the center of the abyss. Why am I dreaming of the abyssal eye? Saul tried hard to open his eyes wide, wanting to see all the details around him clearly and deduce the current time and the cause of events. Before him was an endless ocean. Above his head were heavy, deep, dark clouds. There was nothing else in front of Saul except a huge vortex. But when Saul turned around, he suddenly discovered there was a massive object rapidly approaching him. Prosperous coastlines, towering sea cliffs, familiar seaside cities. Saul quickly recognized that the coastal continent rushing toward him was Iscaper. However, the continent was moving very fast. By the time Saul realized this, the islands at the very front of Iscaper continent had already entered the whirlpool of the abyss. Islands without sufficient land area were like fallen leaves thrown into a whirlpool. They had no resistance, couldn't leave, and could only spin as they were pulled by dark currents into the depths. The frontmost small islands had already been swallowed by seawater, swallowed by darkness. Next, the edge of Iscaper continent also entered the vortex zone and suddenly dropped downward. Then, as Iscaper further entered the range of the abyssal eye, the entire continent began to tilt slightly downward. Although it was only a slight change in tilt angle, buildings and rocks on the ground began to slide and tumble. Then the entire continent began to accelerate its tilt under gravity's influence. The first fracture appeared. The frontmost land suddenly separated from the continent's main body and accelerated into the abyss, quickly disintegrating again in the turbulent vortex before finally disappearing. Seeing the fate of the continental parts that entered the abyss, even Saul, standing in the air, felt his heart skip a beat. However, when he turned back to look at Iscaper again, he was even more shocked to discover that the area of Iscaper closest to the abyssal eye had entirely turned black. The coastline that had originally been covered with soil, forests, mountains and towns had now completely become black, mud-like substances. Only from the vague outlines above could one tell what these black muds had originally been. Buzz! A strange and piercing buzzing sound suddenly rang in Saul's mind. His brain felt a sharp pain, and he could no longer focus on observing other places, curling up while holding his head. Yes. Ha! Saul immediately opened his eyes. The pain from the dream just now was so clear, as if he had already experienced everything once. But when he broke free from the nightmare, the pain in his memory and the fear in his heart began to recede like a tide. In less than a minute, the torment he had just felt disappeared completely, as if it had never happened. Little Algae had somehow emerged from Saul's neck, using its black little tongue to lick the sweat beads seeping from Saul's forehead. Saul pushed Little Algae away with mixed feelings. "Thank you, Little Algae, but don't eat random things." His body had undergone 3 wizard body transformations and was no longer an ordinary human structure. The sweat was more of a stress secretion from his soul body being stimulated. It represented a loss of control. If an ordinary person touched it, their body would probably rot into a puddle of thick juice within minutes. Although Little Algae could withstand large amounts of black tide pollution, it was better not to eat other things randomly. "Brother Saul, did you have a nightmare?" Penny also flew out, circling around Saul. As a nightmare butterfly, Penny could vaguely sense the content of Saul's dreams, but couldn't see clearly. It also didn't dare to see too clearly. "It's fine, it's not the first time." As he spoke, the sweat beads on Saul's forehead had already been automatically reabsorbed by his body. He let himself slowly calm down. The nightmare just now was probably a scene of Escaper being swallowed by the abyss. Only at the end, something had affected Saul's spirit, causing his pain to exceed his tolerance and directly break free from the prophetic dream. If what the dream showed was a scene of the world's end, was I seeing this scene when I was preparing to flee this world after failing to resist the black tide? What entered the abyss was Escaper. Does this mean Stat Continent and Nefrit Continent have already been swallowed? So when continents are swallowed by the abyssal eye, they all turn into black mud. This way, if the Chaos Realm is indeed the first disappeared Desettle continent, then all the topography there being changed makes sense. After all, everything from the past has disappeared, leaving only a bit of crust and sand and gravel dried by the black tide. Saul slowly closed his eyes. Seeing scenes of the world's end had a tremendous impact on Saul. After quite a while, Saul could continue thinking. My prophetic dreams generally don't occur too long before events actually happen. However, my mental power has now improved significantly, so the scenes in dreams could happen as far as 3 to 5 years from now. But time is already very urgent. But Saul didn't understand. Although he was also clear that the complete eruption of the black tide was just a matter of time, it shouldn't happen in 3 to 5 years. In the calculations of the Tribunal and Stargate Council, even if the black tide were to completely erupt, it should still need 30 to 50 years, and this was estimated using the most extreme and pessimistic methods. But in the dream, why did the apocalypse arrive so early? There must be other important factors that appeared and affected the entire apocalyptic process. Saul began searching for details in the prophetic dream. Did we overlook something? Right, red worms didn't appear in the dream. My plan should be to use red worms to offset the abyssal eye's pollution. Was it because it failed and consumed all the red worms, so even the last red worm didn't appear? The intelligence Saul saw in the dream was still insufficient. If only I could have prophetic dreams again. The power of prophetic dreams came from star-shaped eyes, and star-shaped eyes were actually Saul himself, so he should also be able to control his own dreams. But the current him still couldn't manipulate the power of star-shaped eyes. I still need to advance to 4th rank wizard as soon as possible. Otherwise, facing the Black Tide apocalypse being merely 3rd rank, even if it's top-level 3rd rank, the power is still too weak. Saul directly put away little algae and the nightmare butterfly. Don't come out for now. I need to find a red worm to verify my thoughts. The next second, Saul's figure disappeared. When he reappeared, he found he couldn't see the star observatory tower in any direction. He should have already left Olga's capital. Is this another city? I don't know if I'm still in Olga Duchy. Just as Saul thought this, he heard a voice behind him. Saul, how did you come here too? Saul turned around and saw Geoffrey with a face full of surprise, completely unsurprised. Chapter 971, Reproduction and Cultivation. I passed the Stargate Council selection, didn't I? Geoffrey touched his nose, trying to suppress the pride in his heart. Now I've been sent out to study. They said after I finish learning, they'll let me work in the Star Observatory Tower. Is that so? Saul's gaze locked onto the short, fat tail of the red worm that was exposed and constantly wriggling. Then, congratulations to you. He suddenly raised his left hand. The skin on his fingertip quickly receded, revealing a section of white finger bone. Before Geoffrey could react, he lightly touched the red worm's tail. Geoffrey only had time to move his eyeballs before his entire body trembled violently like he'd been electrocuted, then fell straight down. Saul and Geoffrey had originally been standing on the street, but the instant Saul exposed his finger bone, the two were transferred to high altitude. Therefore, when Geoffrey fell, his entire body was plummeting toward the ground. However, a gray, semi-transparent tentacle wrapped around his body, letting him float in midair. Even though Geoffrey had fallen, Saul's left hand still hadn't left the red worm on his neck. At this moment, the red worm that no one could originally touch was constantly trembling, also as if it had been electrocuted. Douglas's hint was obvious places that could quickly provide red worms with large amounts of pollution were either the abyss or starry sky. But Douglas probably couldn't imagine that Saul carried the most polluting anchor point from the abyss on his body. Saul had already guessed that the pollution source the Stargate Council used to create deactivated red worms was also anchor points. Because they had jointly controlled the borderland with the tribunal for a long time, anchor points produced every time storm eyes erupted would be collected by these two organizations. It was also because of so many years of accumulation that the Stargate Council could create so many deactivated red worms in such a short time after discovering red worms. Slowly, the violently trembling red worm finally stopped moving. Just to be safe, Saul didn't immediately move his hand away, but waited a while longer before letting his skin rewrap the anchor point. At this time, Saul switched to his right hand to grab the motionless red worm. A star-shaped eye emerged from his right palm the instant it touched the red worm. Saul's fingers felt no feedback, but his soul body clearly sensed he had grasped something light and airy. Then Saul pulled hard, and the red worm that now only had a small red tip left was yanked out by Saul. The unconscious Geoffrey convulsed, and dark red blood began flowing from his 7 orifices. A rotting smell also spread with the flowing dark red blood. Saul tightened his tentacle and lifted Geoffrey higher. He was already dead. Or rather, when Saul left the Star Observatory Tower and saw Geoffrey excitedly saying he'd been chosen by the Stargate Council, he was already dead. What was alive was merely the thinking inertia belonging to a wizard apprentice. The red worm could give the remaining consciousness a possibility to continue, but this continuation would eventually be exhausted. At that time, the red worm might leave the original host and seek the next target. Someone like Geoffrey, a second-level wizard apprentice, could probably only hold on for a few months, while third-rank wizards could persist for many years. But did the Stargate Council send him out just to wait for his death? Saul put away Jeffrey's corpse. There wasn't even his own soul left inside. Or did they want to wait for Jeffrey to die so the red worm could continue eroding other people? The Stargate Council cultivated red worms of various sizes, but obviously the larger red worms were more useful. A red worm that had only grown on Jeffrey for a few months couldn't satisfy the Stargate Council's requirements. Saul's sudden removal of Jeffrey had already alarmed those secretly observing Jeffrey, but when they rushed to the street, they couldn't see where Saul and Jeffrey had gone and could only wander the streets in confusion. Some were obviously going to run back and report this matter. Meanwhile, Saul in the high altitude clearly saw the panic of several people in the city below. He said nothing and directly teleported again, returning to Byron's side. Byron was currently in the laboratory measuring the size changes of the red worm on his body. Discovering Saul had appeared in the room, he only glanced up casually before lowering his head to continue his experiment. He was already used to Saul, who could teleport, suddenly appearing beside him from time to time. Saul walked forward and waited until Byron finished measuring before taking out Jeffrey's corpse and the newly obtained red worm. I've confirmed that the method Douglas provided is correct. Byron glanced sideways at Jeffrey. During his time at the Stargate Council, he had seen too many such corpses. This red worm only counts as a larva. Saul nodded. Kismet had also told him this knowledge. Red worms complete growth similar to molting by completely devouring a wizard. And this time, I also figured out that parasitized wizards actually die the moment they're parasitized by red worms. Red worms, this special existence that only had consciousness, could mimic the consciousness of the parasitized person, making those who couldn't see red worms completely unable to discover that people around them had already been replaced by worms. But what I'm seeing now are basically adult or larval forms. Have you seen the initial form of red worms? Saul asked Byron, since Byron had been working at the Star Observatory Tower for a long time. But Byron shook his head. They say it's an egg form, but none of us have seen it. It's probably a secret only known to those Chairman Alec trusts most. That's somewhat troublesome. Saul sat in a nearby chair, looking at Jeffrey's corpse. To consume black tide pollution, these few worms aren't enough. But we can't possibly use wizards' lives to cultivate red worms like the Stargate Council does. Possessing the inertization formula and soul-fixing magical formations, Saul had always believed wizards were the main force against black tide pollution. Using wizards' lives to exchange for worms was something only Alec, who was bent on escaping, could do. However, if he could command and control large numbers of red worms, it could also help wizards counter the most dangerous pollution sources. First, find larval red worms. We need to understand red worms' reproduction methods so we can find ways to obtain sufficient quantities of worms. Saul said to Byron, Senior, you continue researching how to make red worms continue growing. Byron took several notebooks from beside the experimental table and gave them to Saul. People who can see red worms won't be parasitized by red worms, but red worms will lie on us. The half-elf taught me to feed red worms with chaotic consciousness, which can make them grow larger and larger. Chaotic consciousness. Saul quickly flipped through the notebook once and immediately understood Byron's meaning. What the half-elf feeds the worm on you is the already chaotic elven consciousness from the world barrier. Byron sighed lightly. Yes, completely chaotic, mixed into a mess that can't be separated. Although toxic and dangerous, it's nutritionally rich for the worms. Chapter 972. Is it you? The person changing shifts patted her shoulder, indicating she should come up. Fiona took one last look at the massive creature before her, handed the pipeline instruments to her replacement, then quickly surfaced. As soon as she broke the surface, two wizard apprentices respectfully approached and handed her two blankets. When the blankets were unfolded, they revealed densely packed leech-like worms inside. Fiona frowned slightly. Even though she had experienced this several times, she still didn't like the feeling of these worms lying on her body, absorbing moisture. But it had to be done. Other methods of wiping and bathing couldn't recover the liquid on her body without producing pollution. Fiona closed her eyes and let the two apprentices wrap the towels around her front and back. Instantly, the mouths of hundreds of leeches on the towels began sucking on her body. Fiona closed her eyes, trying hard to ignore the tingling, itchy sensation from her body. 10 minutes later, the two apprentices removed the blankets. The worms hanging on them had all grown fatter, while Fiona's body was completely clean. Only then did she go change clothes. The wizard apprentices quickly hung up the blankets, then carefully used tweezers to pick the white, fat worms one by one into a crucible. When the crucible was full of worms, another person began heating it with natural fire. The worms inside quickly began melting like butter, transforming from a pot of wriggling worms into a pot of cream-colored liquid. Thin worm skins floated on top. The wizard apprentice used a glass stirring rod to break up the cicada-wing thin skins. Finally, the liquid in the crucible became more turbid. After the liquid cooled slightly, they poured it back into the water pool where Fiona had just dived. This maximized the prevention of waste from the murky liquid in the pool. At this time, Fiona had already come to the second floor to report the situation to Murich. The mother worm's condition isn't very good. It probably won't be able to lay eggs again in the short term. Murich's two telescope-like eyes protruded and retracted. The mother worm might be regaining consciousness. He kept rotating the absorption pen in his hand, letting the ink inside spill onto the table. We need more faceless ones. At least we need a complete one. Fiona immediately suggested, the person we saw beside Wizard Saul last time is very likely a faceless one. He seemed to recognize me. I can go lure him over. Murich smacked his lips. What a pity. You don't know, he's just a faceless one soul occupying a good vessel to move around. Faceless one souls are even rarer, but they have no utility value for our experiments. Fiona lowered her head, not hiding the disgust on her face, but perhaps he would know the whereabouts of other faceless ones. Unfortunately, faceless ones rarely contact each other and mostly act alone. We could still try. Heh, Fiona, you know he belongs to Saul. The chairman hasn't given up on winning over Saul yet. Fiona raised her head again and said stubbornly, what the chairman needs is Wizard Saul, not his slave. If Wizard Saul has any dissatisfaction, we can provide compensation. If he's still unsatisfied, I can let him deal with me as he pleases. Murich threw the quill pen in his hand onto the table and leaned back against his chair. Why go to such lengths? Fiona, we can also look elsewhere. Fiona clenched her fists. I don't want to let any faceless one go. You know they killed my father. Murich sighed deeply. As you wish. After all, you're the most suitable person for breeding mother worms and eggs. With permission granted, Fiona immediately had people investigate Saul and Agu's whereabouts. They couldn't find Saul, and they also couldn't locate Agu's movements. After smashing a table, Fiona decided to personally search for Agu. After spending several days stationed outside Byron's house, Fiona finally waited for Agu to come out alone. She immediately approached and actively said, "Haven't we met before?" Seeing Fiona, Agu was first stunned, then turned his head wanting to avoid her. But Fiona stepped sideways to block Agu's path again. You called out my name the moment you saw me last time. What are you pretending not to recognize me for now? I've investigated. You and Wizard Byron came to Escaper a year ago. Before that, you never came to Olga and never met me. I think the only connection I could have with faceless ones should be that one incident, so I've come to talk with you. Fiona blocked Agu while speaking in a rapid stream, not giving Agu any chance to escape. Agu had no choice but to stop. "Fiona, I need to complete a task my master assigned me now. Let's talk later." Hearing it was Saul's assignment, Fiona finally stepped aside. Agu hurriedly lowered his head to avoid her, looking like he didn't dare make eye contact. Although Fiona stepped aside, she immediately followed behind. On the second floor of the villa, Saul left the window. "She's been waiting outside for so many days. Her patience should be exhausted. Let Agu lead her around a bit more." Penny landed on Saul's shoulder. "Brother Saul, you actually let Agu find Fiona. Aren't you afraid he'll get too excited seeing his daughter and say everything?" Saul wasn't worried at all. "They know clearly what we want to do, and we know clearly what they want to do. Agu won't say anything, and it doesn't matter if he does. Moreover, Agu also needs an opportunity to have a showdown with Fiona." Fiona was only 5 when she followed Agu, and they didn't separate until she was 15. Normally speaking, the father in Fiona's memory should be Agu, and Agu obviously cares a lot about this daughter of his. Given the current situation, we'll have conflict sooner or later. Let Agu make his own choice. Bearing the burden of mission and choice, Agu wandered around outside for a few circles, completing Saul's so-called task, but was still pulled back to the underground base where they first met by Fiona that evening. "Actually, you came looking for me to find faceless ones, right? Your experiments are short on materials again." Walking through the underground base, Agu was first to break the silence. "You're also a faceless one, right? I do want to know the whereabouts of other faceless ones through you, but if you're unwilling to say, I can't do anything about it since you're that person's servant." Fiona continued leading Agu deeper into the base, to depths Agu hadn't entered during his previous visit. At the base entrance, there were still several wizards and apprentices visible, but the deeper they went, the fewer people there were. Agu wasn't afraid Fiona would set any traps for him. Saul wasn't far from him now, and as a consciousness body residing in the diary's black pages, he could transmit simple signals to Saul. When Fiona first kept watch on their movements, Saul had already discovered her activity and deliberately waited several days before letting Agu appear. If Fiona really had something important to find Agu about, she should be quite hurried by now, making detours less likely. So before Agu deliberately appeared, Saul had already agreed with Agu that if danger arose, he should immediately call for Saul to retrieve him into the diary. But before following Fiona away, Agu had already decided that unless absolutely necessary, he wouldn't notify Saul. It wasn't until they had walked to a place where no one was around that Agu spoke again. This time he mustered his courage, because he knew that once he spoke, he would have to face that old matter from years ago. "If you don't necessarily need to know about faceless ones, then what do you want to know by bringing me here?" Fiona stopped in front of a white warehouse, turned to face Agu, her mouth a straight line, eyes half narrowed. "I want to know, was it you who killed my father back then?" Chapter 973, Not the Father. Could Fiona already know who he was? But Fiona's behavior was completely different from what Agu expected. He had also thought that perhaps after Fiona learned he had raised her for 10 years, she might be conflicted and troubled, but it shouldn't be such pure hatred. Could Fiona really think he had killed her biological father to obtain a new identity? Agu had originally wanted to avoid Fiona, but since he had decided to face her, he didn't want the child he considered his daughter to think of him this way. "Your father wasn't killed by me. When I saw him, he was already dead." "Is that so?" Fiona's expression didn't change much, appearing not to believe Agu. But there really wasn't any good way to prove this matter. Except for Agu himself, no one knew what had happened back then. And for something so long ago, even magic couldn't accurately recreate it. This was probably why Fiona had chosen to ask him directly today. "You can cast truth detection on me," Agu offered to prove himself. Truth detection was a high-level magic that could investigate whether someone was lying. However, this spell required the cooperation of the person being detected, and they needed to be emotionally stable, otherwise the accuracy wasn't high. Agu's suggestion surprised Fiona somewhat, but she wasn't polite about it. "Then excuse me, please come in with me." Fiona turned around again, facing the white door of the warehouse and silently reciting an incantation. The door then slowly opened. This is the deepest part of the base, but there aren't many materials stored here. It's a very suitable place for testing and killing. If you have a clear conscience, then come in with me. But if you really are the one who killed my father, you can still choose to leave now. For Wizard Saul's sake, I'll kill you later. After speaking, Fiona walked into the warehouse without waiting for Agu outside. Agu didn't hesitate at all and stepped directly into the warehouse. However, as soon as he entered the warehouse, the door behind him suddenly slammed shut with a bang. Only then did Agu see that the interior walls of this warehouse, which was quite large but very spacious inside, were actually covered with many magical formations. After the door closed, these magical formations began operating one by one, as if they had been electrified. Agu turned to run, but discovered that the room was filled mostly with binding formations. It was far too easy to bind him, someone who barely qualified as second rank. Agu couldn't rush out the door. He first sensed Saul and found he could still contact the diary, which calmed him down slightly. "Are these the tests you wanted to conduct, to see if I would try to escape when feeling danger?" Agu had intended to question Fiona, but when he looked up, he saw the woman opposite him smiling coldly. "Don't overthink it. I never intended to test whether you were lying." Fiona raised her hand, and a dark arc of light appeared in her palm. "I just need to strip away your consciousness bit by bit and organize it into information to know the whereabouts of other faceless ones." "You are still looking for faceless ones." Agu felt his heart slowly sink to the bottom. "So you don't actually care about the cause of your father's death?" The smile disappeared from Fiona's face. "Because there's no need to care. I already know clearly that my father was killed by a faceless one. I don't care who the murderer is. I just need to kill all the faceless ones, and naturally I'll avenge my father." Just as Fiona was about to press the dark arc in her hand into a magical formation on the ground, Agu hurriedly stopped her. "Fiona, Nana, your father really wasn't killed by me." The single word Nana suddenly made Fiona stop her movements. She looked up with some shock and anger. "Who gave you permission to call me Nana? Do you think imitating my father's existence will make me spare you?" After speaking, Fiona pressed down the dark arc in her hand even faster. The light in the entire room suddenly dimmed, and the world seemed to turn dark yellow, like the oppressive sky before a storm. Agu only felt flames suddenly rise from beneath his feet. Before he could react, he was suddenly ejected from the body vessel he currently occupied. As Agu's soul body was exposed, the magical formations around shot out dark arcs from their centers. These arcs crisscrossed in the air. Agu had no time to say anything else, and could only immediately start dodging. But the entire room, except for Fiona's location, was filled with dark arcs. Agu immediately approached Fiona, but his speed wasn't enough. At a distance of 2 meters from her, he was still trapped in a small space isolated by multiple arcs. He cautiously avoided touching those arcs and turned toward Fiona. Fiona showed him absolute hostility. Would this hostility be the Stargate Council's attitude toward Saul? If Agu faced anyone else at this moment, he would have chosen without hesitation to leave and return to the diary, informing Saul of the Stargate's conspiracy. But facing him was Fiona, the daughter he had raised for 10 years, the daughter he kept deep in his heart even after death without mentioning to anyone. Even if Fiona identified him as his father's killer, Agu didn't want Fiona to become cannon fodder and a pawn in the confrontation between Saul and the Stargate. After all, Saul had no feelings for Fiona whatsoever. He had to think of another way. Agu suddenly approached the Ark, looking at Fiona outside like he was in a prison cell. "Nana, I think you've misunderstood something. Only I would call you Nana. Your real father always called you Finny." Fiona was stunned, and the circulation of magic in her hands also slowed down. "What Finny? I don't have that name," she said hatefully, not knowing what Agu was talking about. Seeing Fiona's confused expression, Agu actually breathed a sigh of relief. "I know now. I understand." A smile appeared on his face, a feeling of immense relief that made him want to both cry and laugh. "Nana, your real father died in an accident when you were 5 years old. And I actually was your father before you turned 15. Agu finally said it. He had never dared to say it because he wasn't clear how Fiona would view him after discovering he was just a faceless one who had replaced her original father. He didn't dare imagine whether his daughter would deny those 10 years of life experience. Would she hate him and think he had ruined her life? But now that he had said it, Agu actually felt relieved. Now he had said everything. He just needed to wait for judgment. Agu's explanation wasn't extensive, but Fiona vaguely understood. She finally knew why her memories always had contradictory places. Sometimes she felt her father should be like this. Other times she felt her father should be like that. So, she really had two fathers. And the one she thought had been killed by a faceless one, her most beloved father, had actually been a real faceless one all along. The beautiful childhood that had accompanied her entire life wasn't left to her by her father. Chapter 974, How Wonderful. He breathed a sigh of relief and carefully moved away from the dark light arcs in front of him. "I still remember every detail of those 10 years. If you don't believe me, you can ask me. We separated when you were 15. It's been so long, I couldn't possibly have temporarily searched your father's soul, could I?" Fiona really did ask several questions, some of which had already become blurred in her memory, but Agu could quickly recall them each time, as if these memories often replayed in his mind. "Then why did you leave when I was 15? "I borrowed your father's identity back then because I was fleeing from others' pursuit, and I left because those hunting me discovered the identity I had borrowed. If I hadn't left, you would have been killed by my enemies too." Fiona frowned as she listened. Looking at Agu's completely unfamiliar face, she couldn't match him with the father in her memory. "Who was hunting you?" Agu lowered his eyes, revealing a bitter smile. "Would you believe me if I said I'm not clear about it myself?" "Ridiculous," Fiona immediately shouted. "Nana," Agu looked at Fiona's face that could no longer be considered young. "I'm sorry Daddy couldn't protect you well." The distrust that had surfaced again on Fiona's face froze upon hearing Agu's apology. Father had left many years ago. Fiona was no longer that helpless 15-year-old girl. After becoming a true wizard and joining the Stargate Council, she had almost forgotten even her initial sadness. The only thing she hadn't forgotten was her hatred for faceless ones. Because the person who saved her said that the father who had worked so hard to raise her was killed by a faceless one. There were many people in this world who had similarly lost loved ones because of faceless ones. And faceless ones not only killed loved ones, but also transformed into their faces, enjoying the beautiful lives that originally belonged to others. Over and over, brainwashing-like education made Fiona thoroughly hate faceless ones. Even if it meant destroying her own future, she wanted the faceless one race to completely disappear from the world. But who would have thought that her father, who had been dead for many years, was also a faceless one? Fiona's long-held beliefs were strongly impacted. Her chest kept rising and falling like a fish dragged ashore. "Fiona, Agu wanted to say something more but was interrupted by Fiona. Don't talk anymore. I need to be alone and think. Although showing resistance, Fiona still released all the dark arcs trapping Agu. You should go first. I need to think this through properly. When I figure it out, I'll come find you. Agu also knew that it would be difficult to get Fiona to immediately believe him. Her current behavior was already quite beyond Agu's expectations. All right, he naturally couldn't bear to see Fiona in pain. After the arcs disappeared, he voluntarily stepped back. Then I'll go back first. If you want to find me, you can come to Wizard Byron's residence anytime. Fiona kept her head down and didn't respond to Agu. Agu looked deeply at Fiona once, then helplessly turned to leave. But just at this moment, the warehouse door that had just been sealed by magical formations was suddenly opened from outside. Light shone in, making Agu instinctively squint his eyes. Then he saw a familiar face walk in. Murich's two telescope-like eyes had contracted to their limit. He first looked at the silent Fiona, then turned to show Agu a smile. Are you heading back? Agu had no good feelings toward Murich, but considering the other party was also a third-rank wizard, he still nodded respectfully. Yes, Lord Murich. I heard Fiona invited you here to learn about faceless ones. This child is sometimes rather impulsive. She didn't hurt you, did she? No, we've already cleared up our misunderstanding. Please don't make things difficult for her either. Murich smiled, but his eyes remained contracted very short, making Agu uncomfortable to look at. Of course not. Fiona is a very important wizard to me. These words sounded somewhat strange. Agu immediately felt fatherly concern and instinctively didn't want Murich to be alone with Fiona. Then, Lord Murich, could you escort me out of here? Of course, Murich showed no airs whatsoever, but I have a few questions I'd like to ask you. When Agu heard Murich say, but he was already getting nervous, please ask. Do you know the whereabouts of any other faceless ones? Agu narrowed his eyes. Murich's meaning was still to seek traces of other faceless ones for experiments. Asking such a question so openly in front of him obviously didn't really take Agu seriously. Despite his inner disgust, to avoid affecting Fiona, Agu still answered honestly. After leaving Iskaper, I was trapped in Lord Gorse's wizard tower until recent years when I left with Lord Saul. So I really don't know the whereabouts of any faceless ones. Murich sighed disappointedly. It seems you really don't know. By the way, do you have any methods that could help us find faceless ones in Iskaper? Agu still shook his head. Forget not knowing. Even if he knew, how could he possibly tell the person in front of him? Well then, it seems there really is no way. Murich stepped toward Agu. Agu immediately became alert, ready to send a signal to Saul at any time. However, Murich calmly walked around Agu and went to Fiona's side. You heard too. Now we really have no other way to obtain new faceless ones. Only then did Fiona raise her head, saying to Murich with a guilty expression, I'm sorry, sir. I'll think of other methods as soon as possible. She didn't mention Agu again, afraid Murich would directly decide to extract Agu's soul. Though she was still conflicted by the sudden news, she had already begun instinctively protecting Agu. I have a backup plan. Murich's voice had no fluctuation, as if he wasn't angry about Fiona's failure. Just as Fiona was about to ask what it was, she suddenly felt her vision rise much higher. She seemed to have been lifted up by Murich, but could no longer feel her body's existence. She vaguely realized something but didn't look down to search for her body. Instead, she used her last bit of strength to lift her eyelids and look at Agu standing at the door. Agu was backlit, so she couldn't see very clearly. But this blurred silhouette suddenly reminded Fiona of memories she had forgotten for decades. That blurred silhouette was so familiar, just like when she was 15, when father left home for work, and she, who loved to stay in bed, had just woken up, rubbing her eyes, drowsily saying goodbye to Father. What she saw, then, seemed to be just such a figure. Fiona saw Father running toward her, as if he wanted to say, "Nana, Daddy isn't going to work today." How wonderful! Agu rushed forward like a madman. At this moment, he had forgotten he was just a second-rank soul body, and forgotten that the man opposite him was a third-rank wizard highly valued by Alec. He only wanted to kill Murich in front of him. He was going to kill him. Chapter 975, Not a Daughter. No need to be so angry, Mr. Agu. This woman is not your daughter. Agu was struck by Fiona's head, and the magic power he had been building up was immediately scattered. His form staggered and he nearly fell, but he still tightly held his daughter's head, unwilling to let her fall to the ground and be stained with filth. Murich's calm words made his overwhelming fury pause, stuck in his chest, suffocating him until he felt like vomiting blood, as if he might burst at any moment. What do you mean?" Agu's chest heaved violently. "Just the surface meaning." Murich bent down to pick up the limp corpse from the ground, cradling it horizontally like embracing a lover. "She's not your daughter. Your Fiona was already killed when she was 15. This current Fiona is actually the same as you. A faceless one." Agu's legs went weak and he fell directly to his knees. He stared wide-eyed at the calm-faced Murich, his mind already in chaos. Murich raised his chin. "Take a closer look at the head in your hands." Agu slowly lowered his head, only to discover that the head in his hands had somehow lost all facial features. The head was smooth with no contours. Even the hair had naturally fallen off. What Agu was holding was just a flesh ball that still retained bodily warmth. If not for the wound on the neck remaining unchanged, no one could imagine any connection between this flesh ball and the head from just moments ago. But Agu knew very clearly. This was what faceless ones looked like after death, or after losing their identity. No features, no characteristics, no identity. They could only wander in the mortal world, searching for the meaning of their existence. If she's not Nana, why did she know about things between me and Nana? What did you do to Nana? Agu's voice grew louder and louder. His daughter's true whereabouts made his mind slightly clearer. Murich shrugged. "We didn't know you would become Saul's servant then. To hunt down an evil faceless one, we naturally had to find every possible way to seek your information. So we performed soul searching on poor little Fiona. But don't worry, she was already dead for a long time when we found her. Soul searching didn't cause her much pain, it actually helped her find relief." No one would believe such nonsense. But Agu currently didn't even have the ability to get angry. He had been happy that his daughter was alive and had successfully advanced to second rank, never expecting that Nana had never lived past 15. The huge gap made him feel empty inside his chest cavity, as if his heart had somehow withered and died along with everything else. How ridiculous, he was a dead person. Where would a dead person get a heart? Murich seemed not to notice Agu's devastation and continued his thoughtful explanation. "To lure you back then, we specially blurred the memories of a faceless one captive, turning her into the new Fiona. Unfortunately, you never appeared again after that, so our careful arrangements came to nothing. But what surprised us was that the new Fiona actually possessed decent magical talent. Moreover, after she began hatting faceless ones, she achieved good results every time she participated in experiments related to faceless ones. Perhaps this is because you naturally understand yourselves very well. Considering that she might be useful someday, I kept her, cultivated her, and made her into an excellent second-rank wizard who specialized in experimenting on faceless ones." Here, Murich even sighed. "I didn't want to kill her now either. After raising her for so many years, I was quite satisfied with this earnest little girl. But unexpectedly, the cultivation nest for breeding red worm mothers recently suffered damage and needs at least one unit of faceless ones as material to repair it. We originally wanted to find other faceless ones through you to repair the cultivation tank, but didn't expect that you truly don't know other faceless ones' whereabouts. So I had to use Fiona first for emergency purposes. Speaking of this, Murich even lowered his head to kiss Fiona's neck, then said with bloodied lips, "So you don't need to be angry, she really wasn't your daughter." Agu didn't let go of the head in his arms, even holding it tighter. Back then, who killed Nana? We can't determine that either. It should have been whoever was hunting you. After losing your trail, he immediately found Fiona and tortured her to death. But I heard from the wizard who executed the mission that the killer should have been a half-elf. Agu suddenly looked up. "What did you say, a half-elf? Where did that half-elf go afterward?" He happened to know a half-elf. Yes, a half-elf. After brutally killing Fiona, he went to Stat Continent. But the Stargate doesn't have enough informants there, so we lost track of him. If you want revenge, it probably won't be easy. After all, whether a half-elf still exists or has already mutated can't be determined. Murich weighed the corpse in his hands. "Oh, I can't chat with you any more and waste time. After all, the materials won't be fresh much longer. I'll have someone escort you out. I need to go to the laboratory." Murich casually found a wizard apprentice to have Agu follow him out. Agu was obviously unwilling, but he didn't have the power to resist Murich, and besides, he wanted to figure out what was going on with the half-elf. He looked back at Murich once, held the head in his arms tightly, felt dejected, but no longer had the strength to fight desperately. He could only follow the wizard apprentice away. Meanwhile, Murich carried the still bleeding corpse to the laboratory near the White Warehouse. This was exactly where they researched red worm mothers. At this moment, a girl had just surfaced from the large pool in the center of the room, and wizard apprentices immediately rushed up to wipe her body with towels covered in worms. The girl glanced at Murich entering and the headless corpse in his arms, silently uttering, "What a shameless bastard." Murich wasn't angry and handed the corpse to the girl. "Say whatever you want. When developing cultivation nest materials, please be as quick as possible, Wizard Corey." The turbid liquid on Corey's body had already been absorbed by the worms. Her face still showed an expression of not caring about anything. "I will. I just hope you won't suddenly run over here and remove my head, at least during the experiment." Murich gave a short laugh, as if Corey had just made a joke. "I'm also trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. After all, the other party is Saul's soul body. If I lose him, Saul might come over with his terrifying magical curses to teach me a lesson." Corey ignored him, only glancing at his back as Murich left. That look was like viewing a dead person. Chapter 976, Angry. Saul sat on the huge pink sofa with his eyes closed, resting. Black vines crawled throughout the entire room, leaving barely any space to step. 4 deactivated red worms floated in the room, shuttling between sunlight and shadow. What happened? Byron's first reaction was to close the door. "There's something I need to ask you." Saul opened his eyes and sat up straight on the soft sofa. "Ask the half-elf." Seeing Saul's serious expression, Byron nodded and sat in the chair across from Saul. "Go ahead and ask." Agu went to see Fiona, but Saul thought of Agu's deathly expression when he returned, and his soul body struggling like a fly trapped in a spider's web. Without him saying more, Saul could understand Agu's pain. That bastard Murich did it on purpose. He deliberately gave Agu hope, then deliberately killed the fake Fiona in front of Agu, and when Agu was at his most agitated, he casually told him that everything was fake. The real Fiona had already died horribly at the hands of a half-elf after Agu left. Moreover, from Murich's description, that half-elf was very likely the one inside Byron. Making a half-elf who had theoretically disappeared from this world Agu's enemy meant Agu would never have a chance for revenge in his lifetime. Come to think of it, Murich's actions actually brought him no benefits. Even if he ultimately didn't harm Agu, he couldn't be considered the enemy who killed Agu's daughter. But his torturing of Agu had already made his impression terrible in Saul's mind. The returning Agu had forced himself to tell Saul everything, then returned to the diary without a word, not coming out again even by evening. Seeing Agu like this, Saul suddenly remembered the middle-aged appearance he first saw in the Wizard Tower's library, that frightened soul body who would immediately disappear at the slightest scare. Did that middle-aged soul body hide Agu's fear of his pursuers and worry for the daughter he was forced to abandon? Now all of Agu's worries and fears had come true. He had sealed himself off again. Saul didn't know what purpose Murich had for doing this. He only knew. He was angry. After hearing Saul's brief description, Byron understood what had happened and immediately called to the half-elf hidden in his soul body. A breathtakingly beautiful face appeared above Byron's face. Agu's daughter wasn't killed by me. I once tried to research faceless ones to escape the elves' curse, but I never hunted anyone, never brutally killed ordinary people. Overly intense emotional changes would make me transform toward being an elf. Saul looked at the half-elf's face. This face could change according to the preferences of whoever saw it. That is to say, anyone who saw the half-elf would see what they considered the most beautiful appearance. They might even lose the will to oppose the half-elf because of this. But the current Saul was completely unaffected by the half-elf's abnormal charm. Looking at the other party's face, he could see directly into his heart through his eyes. After a moment, Saul slowly leaned back into the pink sofa. "I believe you." Even the half-elf visibly relaxed after hearing Saul's acknowledgement. Although the person who established communication channels with him was Byron, he was very clear that the only person he could ask for help in bringing the elves back to the real world was Saul. The half-elf slowly withdrew, very consciously returning body control to Byron. He wasn't lying. Byron opened his eyes, his first words expressing his opinion. Saul leaned against the sofa, fingers interlaced. So Murich just randomly found someone to tick off Agu. Even if the real killer isn't him, he can't escape responsibility. Penny flew out from the diary with a clamor. It had been trying to communicate with Agu, but received no response. Penny didn't have particularly good relationships with other consciousness bodies in the diary, but seeing Agu like this still made it feel like one of their own was being bullied. "Brother Saul, let's go kill Murich. I can create the most terrifying nightmare for him." Saul considered for a moment but shook his head. He's from the Stargate Council, currently focused on red worm experiments to complete their migration plan. Right now Alec absolutely won't allow anyone to sabotage his actions. So we just watch Agu get bullied. Penny was indignant. Saul pressed his fingers to his jaw and suddenly revealed a smile. Doesn't Murich like to destroy others' dreams at the last moment? Then let's destroy his dream too. He suddenly sat up straight and said to Byron, "Senior, please go to the Star Observatory Tower to find Alec and ask if it's still possible for me to participate in the Stargate plan." Before Byron could nod, Penny had already landed on little Algie's head. "Wow, Brother Saul, sounds like you're full of bad ideas. I like it." Little Algie, Byron thought for a moment and suggested, "This seems too deliberate. Let's find an opportunity." "That's a very good idea." Douglas nodded with satisfaction, then reminded Saul, "But it's also a very dangerous idea." He leaned forward as if to whisper to Saul, "Even if you can help the Stargate Council solve some experimental problems, they won't necessarily reveal core secrets to you. Instead, you're more likely to be used by them. Secrets are things we have to dig up ourselves. If we just sit and wait for others to give them to us, I might as well wait to die." Saul looked resolute. "Oh, are you pointing that at me?" "Not exactly, but I can't be the only one taking risks while you enjoy the results from outside. That's no way to maintain long-term cooperation." Taking the initiative so quickly, Douglas wasn't angry and even smiled lightly. "But you do have that capability. I'm also curious how the Stargate Council cultivated such large red worms." Saul took out the red worm he had obtained. "I've experimented red worms that devour more consciousness bodies grow faster, but quantity can't be guaranteed. None of the red worms show signs of reproduction." Douglas also said, "It seems we're missing a key piece of the puzzle. For us, how the Stargate Council uses red worms and faceless ones to resist starlight pollution isn't important. What's truly important is how to increase the number of red worms we have." Douglas understood immediately, directly guessing all of Saul's hidden meanings. Saul found it strange. How had such an excellent wizard never been heard of before? Douglas stood up and straightened his somewhat disheveled wizard robe. "I'll go talk to Chairman Alec right now." After speaking, Douglas left the room directly. Seeing the homeowner leave, Saul naturally couldn't stay either, so he followed and left together. Just then, his mind stirred. Someone had placed a secret letter in Byron's house. Chapter 977, If You Can't Beat Them, Join Them. The envelope bore a blurred, complex mark, the unique symbol of the Glare family. Could something have happened on the Glare side? Saul hurriedly picked up the letter. After verifying his mental power, the envelope automatically disappeared. He quickly scanned the contents of the letter, and a delighted smile appeared on his face. Herman had just come downstairs. With Agu's poor state these past 2 days, he had been assisting Saul with experiments. Although Herman's abilities weren't as good as Agu's, he could still help out without problem. "Master, did you receive some good news?" He had already seen the secret letter that suddenly appeared on the ground, but since it was specifically addressed to Saul, if opened by someone else, it would either attack them or destroy the letter, so he didn't dare touch it. Saul didn't hide it from him, waving the letter paper in his hand. "Kelly and Brando have made breakthrough progress on the soul-fixing formation. They're really fast. I don't have any leads on my end yet. Speaking of which, how long have we been here?" Herman thought for a moment. "Almost 3 months now." "Only 3 months." Saul shook the letter paper again. This time the paper turned into snowflake-like white crystals that scattered and fell. Actually, the second half of the letter contained another matter. Kelly, having completed initial experiments, was requesting the Chaos Realm compass from Saul. Next, she wanted to combine the soul-fixing formation with the bone monsters from the Chaos Realm. Kelly could already control bone monsters. If she could combine the soul-fixing formation to ensure the monster's stability, she could even command a bone army. So Kelly urgently needed more bone monsters for training. However, Master Gorsa was also in the Chaos Realm, relying on the unique environment there to recover the mental power he had severely damaged in the Abyssal Eye. If the Chaos Realm compass was given to Kelly, it would be somewhat troublesome for Master Gorsa to leave the Chaos Realm. I wonder how Master is doing now. Saul suddenly remembered he had left Master Gorsa in the Black Desert and hadn't checked on him for a long time. Although Gorsa didn't need others to look after him, Saul still felt somewhat guilty. "Master, what should we do next?" Seeing that Saul hadn't issued new orders for a while, Herman proactively asked. "Continue with the original plan and keep experimenting," Saul told Herman. "Don't let what I'm doing now affect you." Herman carefully observed Saul's expression. Finding that he seemed to have calmed his earlier anger, he dared to ask, "Master, what are you planning to do by approaching that third-rank wizard next door?" Douglas and I are trying to use the special properties of red worms to counter the abyssal eye. The experiments are now on track, but we don't have enough red worms. Since there's no other way to increase their numbers, we can only seek help from the Stargate Council. What Saul said was all true, not even an excuse. Murich just offended me, so naturally I won't bring it up myself. Douglas serves as a good buffer. Herman was actually asking these questions for Agu, who was staying in the diary and wouldn't come out. He said with some worry, "The Stargate Council's plan is probably very dangerous and has many hidden dangers. You don't need to take risks for Agu. We've all seen life and death partings. Agu wouldn't want you to affect your plans for his sake." "Don't worry, it's not that dangerous. I'm not the one charging ahead now." Saul comforted Herman while also speaking for Agu to hear. "This third-rank wizard Douglas is not simple. Besides, joining the Stargate Council isn't purely to deal with Murich. The Black Tide apocalypse is getting closer and closer to us. If we continue researching step by step, by the time the apocalypse erupts, we probably won't have cultivated enough red worms. But with the Stargate Council's power, we can greatly shorten research and experimentation time. You've also seen that the large quantities of deactivated red worms created by the Stargate Council are just casually discarded in the world side. This shows their real experimental purpose isn't deactivated red worms. But that's exactly what we want." Saul closed his eyes and again saw the continent about to be swallowed by the abyss in his dream. He didn't know if everything he was doing could prevent the apocalypse, but he knew that if he did nothing, the world would definitely collapse in the end. What he needed to do now was work harder and faster, based on his observations of the future. From Chairman Alec's composure and Murich's unscrupulousness, you can see that the Stargate's experiments are going smoothly. My joining will make them even smoother. When they use the Stargate to leave the wizard world, all the remaining red worms will be ours. The fastest way to increase wealth was through inheritance. Herman asked worriedly, "Will they leave the red worms behind?" "They will, at least most of them. Because after leaving the wizard world, they'll have no way to find a stable spellcasting environment in the short term. It's even more impossible for them to bring highly dangerous, non-deactivated red worms. Just like how Saul failed to cast magic in the prismatic world and needed death demons to allocate him a stable magical environment before he could establish the prismatic channel. How would the inexperienced Stargate Council, without any big shots protecting them, dare to travel with a bunch of time bombs? We'll take over all the red worms they can't take with them." Herman actually felt that Saul's plan included a step of helping Agu get revenge. But since Saul didn't say it, Herman didn't continue asking. "Now we just wait for the results of Douglas's negotiations with the Stargate Council. I believe he'll definitely succeed." Saul had Herman stay home while he left for a trip. He was both delivering the Chaos Realm compass to Kelly and pretending to express dissatisfaction with Douglas seeking help from the Stargate Council. Murich had just toyed with his servant, which counted as offending him. But they definitely thought Saul would come back soon. After all, in their view, how could a rational wizard really turn against the Stargate Council for a servant's sake? But they probably wouldn't expect that Saul wasn't in a hurry to turn against them. The reason Murich dared to act this way now was simply because he relied on being an important part of the Stargate plan, with Alec protecting him. But Saul wanted to become an even more important part of the Stargate plan. Since he couldn't beat them, he'd join them. Behind closed doors, he could always land a hit. Saul put on his outer clothes and left for the borderland with an angry, indignant appearance. But as soon as he boarded the airship, he saw Kismet, whom he hadn't seen for a long time. This guy had been so dejected recently, but now he held a silver-white harp, serving as a wandering musician on the airship. He wore a casual smile, plucking the strings without any fixed melody. The sound was clear and pleasant, Just with that melancholic yet handsome face, he had already mesmerized the women on the airship. After seeing Saul, he didn't actively approach, as if Saul were just a stranger. So Saul also pretended not to know him and walked straight into the cabin. But Saul was somewhat puzzled. I haven't seen Kismet's harp for a long time. Now that he's taken it out to play again, does it have some special meaning? Chapter 978, Equivalent Exchange. The current Kismet seemed to have forgotten the blow of not being able to become the fifth target. Every day he followed Saul around, either playing music or lying on the roof looking at the sky. Saul felt his problem should be related to the diary, but Kismet had no intention of discussing this point. However, although Kismet wouldn't mention what had happened to him, he had become very obedient. The only remaining stubbornness was probably that phrase, "little brother master." After getting off the airship, Saul asked Kismet, "Are you still following me back?" Kismet tossed the harp in his hands like a ball. "No, I'm not interested in the experiments you're doing now. If you want to kill someone, you can come find me." Hearing Kismet's words, Saul, who had originally wanted to leave as well, suddenly stopped and turned around. "Anyone at all?" "Hi, anyone at all. I'll remember what you said." After leaving the airship, Kismet indeed didn't follow. As for where he was going, Saul had no way to track him. This guy had been much more low-key since recovering his fourth-rank strength. As long as he didn't want to show himself, it seemed no one could find him. Walking toward Byron's residence, Bait in the diary reminded Saul, "This Kismet seems to be following you, as if afraid you wouldn't come back after returning to Stat." Saul didn't stop walking, you noticed too. Suddenly appearing on the airship when he pretended to be angry and returned to Stat, then leaving when he received Douglas's letter asking him to come back. This Kismet, though no longer causing trouble, seemed even more complicated than when he was. What do you think he wants to do? I really don't understand him, but I think he shouldn't be from the Stargate Council. Right, not the Stargate Council. Then who else would be afraid of me leaving and not coming back? Saul raised his hand and saw someone walking against the crowd toward him. It was Douglas. "Done throwing your tantrum." Douglas carried a book in his hand. "If you didn't come back soon, I would have thought you really didn't plan to cooperate with the Stargate Council." Speaking of this, Douglas handed the book to Saul. "If you still want to continue red worm experiments, take a good look at this." Saul took the book but wasn't in a hurry to open it. "They agreed to exchange information with us." "Not easy to arrange," Douglas said. "Our experimental progress is too far behind theirs. We don't have the right to speak." Seeing Saul frown, Douglas smiled and said, "However, I provided them with some ideas for dealing with starlight pollution. If they can succeed in their experiments, they'll agree to leave the most important red worms for us." The most important red worms. Saul immediately understood the key point for increasing red worm numbers was here. Could this red worm species also have a queen responsible for reproduction? You guessed right again. Yes, just like a queen ant, an existence that only focuses on breeding offspring. But right now Chairman Alec only agrees to let us see the red worm queen when we help them achieve breakthrough progress. What ideas did you provide? Can you tell me? Of course, Douglas agreed without hesitation. We're now partners facing the black tide apocalypse together. Naturally, we should share information. He gestured sideways toward a carriage waiting for them on the main road. "Let's talk while we walk. Chairman Alec knows you're taking today's airship and is waiting for us at the Star Observatory Tower. Oh, and that Murich you mentioned is said to be personally apologizing to you." Saul didn't feel particularly pleased hearing that Murich wanted to apologize. Although he'd only met him briefly, Saul could tell that guy was quite rational. Deliberately bullying Agu and angering Saul probably all had ulterior motives. Maybe Saul's move to join the Stargate escape plan and increase his importance within the Stargate to pressure Murich was also part of the other party's design. But Saul had already thought it through clearly. It didn't matter whether there was a conspiracy or what kind of conspiracy it was. The Black Tide apocalypse involved the fate of too many people. All Saul could do now was walk straight toward his goal, encounter obstacles, just crush them. Having expectations, Saul showed no emotional fluctuation when he saw Murich at the Star Observatory Tower entrance. Douglas used secret speech magic to tell Saul, "This Stargate escape plan has already entered its final stages. If what you bring out can further improve Chairman Alec's experimental results, we can get the Queen." The Stargate escape plan. This was how Douglas always privately referred to the Stargate's migration plan. It had to be said, it was very accurate. The two ignored Murich at the door and walked straight in. During this time, Douglas had frequently entered and exited the Star Observatory Tower to research red worms, so he was very familiar with the layout and structure here. He didn't even need anyone to guide him, and led Saul to the underground laboratory. "Saul, you need to watch out for this Douglas." While walking, Bate in the diary suddenly reminded Saul. This guy appeared rather suddenly. That's not much, but I always feel this person has an inexplicable composure about him." Saul pressed his hand to his lips and coughed twice softly, secretly glancing up at Douglas. This middle-aged man with a thin back walked to his right front, head up and chest out, walking with composure. Each of his forward movements and stops had a confident certainty of having everything under control. As if he wasn't leading Saul into someone else's territory, but taking Saul on a tour of his own domain. This was Saul's first time entering the Star Observatory Tower's core laboratory. This was a blindingly white laboratory. The area was very large, but there weren't many wizards here. Before entering the laboratory, both Saul and Douglas had undergone multiple inspections and decontamination to prevent contamination they carried from affecting the experimental results inside. The core laboratory was equipped with numerous magical light sources. White light gently illuminated every corner of the room. Both the floor and ceiling were covered with silver-white pipes. These pipes were exposed, intersecting, intertwining, converging together, then spreading out in all directions. Like a precise and complex circuit board, or like the blood vessel network throughout a human body. All information and energy ultimately gathered in a huge glass cylinder in the center of the laboratory. Saul carefully avoided all the pipes and walked to the front of the glass cylinder. He placed his hand on the glass. It felt smooth and cool. The glass cylinder was filled with milk-like liquid, with occasional silver fragments reflecting light. Before coming in, Douglas had told Saul that in this room, mental power couldn't be released externally, otherwise it would affect experimental results. Of course, the Stargate Council had also set up many devices to suppress mental power that would sound alarms and isolate test subjects upon detecting abnormal mental power. The first batch of test subjects are currently incubating after improvements by Wizard Douglas and cannot be observed. Wizard Saul can look at the experimental data we've recorded here. Murich approached, although he clearly felt Saul's dislike for him. As one of the main project leaders, he fully didn't care about Saul's opinion of him. Anyway, if Saul and the others wanted to use red worms to counter the Black Tide apocalypse, they could only get the Queen after the Stargate left the wizard world by assisting in completing the experiments. For this, Wizard Douglas had already signed a cooperation agreement with Chairman Alec. Exchanging knowledge for survival. Very reasonable. Chapter 979, Extremely Insulting. The soul body inside was very weak and blurred. If he hadn't been pressed against the glass, Saul would have even overlooked that there was life inside. But this should be exactly the effect the Stargate Council was pursuing. Hidden and able to withstand starlight pollution. After ignoring Murich for a moment, Saul turned around to first look at the experimental data. But as soon as he turned around, the first person he saw wasn't Murich with his telescope-like eyes, but Douglas standing further back. Douglas was looking at Saul. Only when their eyes met did he nod nonchalantly and shift his gaze to the experimental data nearby. Saul walked to the side naturally and began looking through the experimental data on the table, but he multitasked, recording each experiment's process and results while speaking mentally with Nightmare Butterfly in the diary. "Penny, was Douglas staring at me just now?" I didn't notice." Penny seemed somewhat frustrated. "I was also attracted by that big glass cylinder and forgot to observe the surroundings." "It's fine," Saul comforted her. "I also didn't notice he was watching me." This statement surprised even Bate in the diary. "Beth, you're less than 10 meters away from him, yet you couldn't sense his gaze. Your current mental power is equivalent to a fourth-rank wizard's." After the first 4 targets of Symphony of Fate took shape, Saul had received a large amount of Destiny Force feedback and could even advance to 4th rank immediately. But pursuing greater power, Saul had been suppressing himself. Bate was initially surprised, then became somewhat excited. "Saul, do you want to make him your 5th target?" A powerful and mysterious 3rd-rank wizard who hadn't suffered any losses, even when negotiating with the Stargate Council. Indeed, a candidate for a target. "No rush," Saul responded mentally. "This guy, I have a feeling I can't quite control him. Let's observe first and preferably get his agreement to cooperate." For some reason, Saul hadn't felt this uncertain, even when selecting the imprisoned 5th-rank water sprite Floco. His intuition neither told him there was danger nor that everything would go smoothly. Facing Douglas, Saul always had a feeling that the person before him wasn't actually there. This uncertainty didn't scare Saul away, but rather made him more interested in Douglas. He had even entrusted the initiative to cooperate with the Stargate Council to him. It was difficult to protect one's own interests in front of the advantaged Stargate Council, and equal cooperation was also difficult. But somehow Douglas had completed the cooperation agreement before he returned, without even revealing his trump card. After thinking, Saul ultimately didn't take out the soul-fixing needle. Since his temporary partner was so capable, he'd keep his trump card hidden. Perhaps it would be useful in some unexpected place later. No longer minding the seemingly harmless Douglas behind him, Saul continued reading the experimental materials on the table. So the Stargate Council really plans to abandon their human bodies. After reading the experimental data, Saul couldn't help shaking his head. With the elves' example before you, you're still planning to completely abandon your bodies. I can only say I admire your courage. But Murich smiled and said, "The elves' failure was because they didn't have a Stargate. Wanting to leave the wizard world but unable to find a way out, more and more soul consciousnesses got trapped in the world barrier's interlayer, until the numerous chaotic mental powers formed a gravitational field specifically targeting the elf race, causing the remaining elves to disappear overnight. But we won't make such mistakes," Murich continued, even walking very close to Saul's side with a punchable smile on his face. "We have a Stargate that can cross world barriers without consumption. We also have red worms to carry our consciousness, plus shells made by faceless ones with extremely strong concealment. Naturally, we can safely leave this world without a future." Saul glanced at Murich and suddenly swung out a semi-transparent gray tentacle. The tentacle was extremely fast. Just as Murich was about to dodge, all the lights in the room suddenly dimmed, changing from pure white to purple-red. This purple-red light immediately bathed everyone in the laboratory in the same color scheme, but Murich's color was deeper and seemed to surge outward in waves. under the colored light's illumination. The color on Murich's body ultimately couldn't break through his body's constraints. Looking at Saul, although he had struck first, his body color was the same as others. Even his left hand that had transformed into a tentacle showed no abnormality. So it also suppresses mental power through fluctuations. But my transformations don't require mental power. After Saul finished speaking, his extended tentacle had already bound Murich tightly. Saul, don't kill our research partner on the first day. Douglas leaned against the wall. Although his words were mediating, his body honestly didn't move at all. He's not our partner. Saul continued waving his tentacles, tossing Murich up and down like playing with a toy. Almost no lethality, but quite insulting indeed. Murich went from initial surprise to anger, finally to grudging endurance. Only when he saw Saul lower his head to look at experimental data again with no intention of releasing him, did he speak with suppressed anger. Lord Saul, have you had enough fun? Saul turned a deaf ear, and the tentacle's movements became even faster. Murich was being shaken so much in his hands that he was almost becoming a blur. Saul, do you want to shake Murich to death, and then become my assistant yourself? Finally, Alec's voice, which hadn't appeared, rang out from outside the laboratory. Only then did Saul put Murich down. The latter staggered a step after landing, looking somewhat theatrical. I don't have Wizard Murich's abilities. Saul turned back to look at Alec walking in from outside. I can only hope that the leftover materials you leave behind can help me survive in this world. When Alec appeared, Douglas also straightened up and smiled in greeting. I thought the chairman wouldn't have time to come out recently. Alec nodded to Douglas as well, obviously valuing this third-rank wizard highly. If either you or Saul is willing to join the migration plan, I can give you Murich to play with. Douglas both waved his hands and shook his head. No way, I don't have your courage to dare leave before advancing to fifth-rank wizard. Douglas's words also had some teasing meaning, but Alec didn't mind at all. There are also first-rank and even below first-rank existences in the starry sky, like these red worms, if not for their special survival methods. How could they freely traverse the starry sky? We're now using knowledge to change destiny. Alec finally looked at Saul. Saul, your mental power is both strong and special. You're actually more suited for the starry sky than all of us here. Won't you really consider leaving with us? I can reserve a spot for you. Douglas's eyes flashed, but he quickly lowered his gaze, hiding the light in his eyes. Saul politely asked in return, your research on red worms is so effective against pollution. Won't you really consider staying to fight the black tide? Alec withdrew his gaze and stared at his feet. Between known terror and unknown terror, I'd rather choose the unknown. Chapter 980, The Reason for Memory Loss. In the days that followed, Saul and Douglas began actively cooperating with Alec in experiments. Saul didn't even cause trouble for Murich anymore. However, this seemed normal to them. After all, the people being toyed with by Murich were just two faceless ones. One of them wasn't even dead. Letting Saul vent his anger was enough, right? Alec wanted to abandon physical bodies, combining souls with deactivated red worms, then externally combining with faceless one hybrid tissue. Although the Stargate would also take some red worms with them, the number of people they could take from this world was limited. They would ultimately still leave Saul and others with large quantities of deactivated red worms. Only after beginning to participate in experiments did Saul understand why Alec had agreed to Douglas's conditions. This Douglas was actually very knowledgeable about faceless ones too. After his modifications, new faceless one materials could better wrap around red worms on the outside, hiding the abnormal soul aura within. Not only that, Douglas also provided his special invisibility formations. Even Alec might overlook someone using the invisibility formations when not paying attention. It could be said that Douglas seemed skilled in research across all areas. Saul kept a low profile. With Douglas taking the lead, he was happy to slack off behind and secretly put his energy into the more important task of directly controlling red worms. After nearly a month, the migration plan achieved breakthrough progress again. After Saul and Douglas joined, the Stargate successfully sent out an individual fused with Wizard Soul, Red Worm Shell, and Faceless One Protective Shell for the first time. And they only recalled the person when they were about to disappear beyond signal range. What was slightly unfortunate was that, because this was only an experimental attempt, they used a first-rank Wizard Soul. Even with shell protection, this wizard went mad the moment he directly faced deep space. Even after being pulled back from deep space, he didn't recover. His entire soul directly mutated into an existence like swamp slime, contaminating even the faceless one-shell materials. Looking at the mutated soul, Alec's face showed no clear sign of disappointment. Saul is skilled at treating pollution. Can you see if this kind of pollution can be resolved? Treat this first-rank wizard. Saul looked at the first-rank wizard whose name he didn't even know. He's already completely mutated. I'm not confident. But Alec shook his head. No, the shell. So they wanted to recover the faceless one shell. It seemed the Stargate Council was really short on faceless ones. If Agu hadn't already died, and what remained was a soul body, they would probably still try to get Agu's body from him as material. Saul didn't refuse. He stepped forward and first manipulated a metal arm lever to separate the wizard soul that had returned from the Stargate. At this time, the test subject looked like a white ostrich egg on the outside. 2 hands could hold it. Saul carefully broke open the white shell that was about to shatter due to constant internal deformation. Immediately, other wizards came up to take away the mutated but still unbroken soul body, wrapped by deactivated red worms. Saul's movements paused. Then he saw the mutated soul body being directly disposed of. Even the uncontaminated red worm shell was casually discarded. Things are truly precious when rare. For the current Stargate Council, first-rank wizards and red worms can't compare to the rarity of Faceless One materials. Saul looked down at the shell that had been broken open with a cross-shaped crack. There were some dotted protrusions on the shell. Is this pollution from the starry sky? Saul had never directly faced starlight pollution before. Now through this shell, he was seeing it for the first time. The starlight pollution he had indirectly experienced came from Pear. The other party had unconsciously been summoned by the starry sky, left the world, then somehow transformed into the appearance of fate lines after unknown experiences. Transformed into the appearance of death demons. You're contacting starlight pollution for the first time, so be careful. Douglas had somehow approached and specifically reminded Saul. Saul responded, then casually asked, "Have you contacted starlight pollution before?" Douglas seemed not to hear Saul's probing and focused intently on Saul's movements. Even without contact, I've heard about it. Starlight pollution is different from black tide pollution. Often invisible and colorless, people might not discover abnormalities in themselves until the second before going mad. This statement could be interpreted any way. Saul was too lazy to continue verbal sparring and slowly transformed his right hand into a transparent gray tentacle. At the same time, a thin fate line was also hidden within Saul's tentacle. Penny observed Douglas's facial expression changes at all times. "Ah, Roger." After preparing, Saul severed the frontmost tip of his tentacle and used tweezers to hold the tip as it contacted the dotted protrusions on the shell. Saul had been cautious enough, but the moment he contacted the pollution on the shell, he still discovered he had thought too simply. Unlike black tide pollution's radiating fluctuations, Starlight pollution had a wider range and very bizarre transmission methods. The moment Saul's severed tentacle contacted the pollution, something additional appeared in his mind. He immediately froze in place, his eyeballs trembling slightly as if seeing something. Douglas watched Saul with a serious expression, apparently ready to interrupt at the first sign of abnormality. But after Saul was stunned for about a minute, he suddenly came back to his senses, then threw away the tweezers in his hand and stepped back 2 paces. He persisted for less time than Douglas had warned about, but what surprised Douglas was that after Saul broke free, he actually seemed unaffected. Douglas couldn't help stepping forward, raising his hand as if wanting to touch Saul's forehead, but Saul suddenly looked at Douglas. Those brilliant eyes made the other's movement freeze in place. "Is there a problem?" Saul asked lightly. Douglas lowered his hand and smiled freely. "Nothing. I just saw you standing there stunned and thought something happened to you." "He's lying, Brother Saul. This time I saw clearly. He only widened his eyes after you regained consciousness." Actually, Douglas's facial expressions hadn't changed too dramatically throughout. But Nightmare Butterfly watched carefully and still captured a trace of abnormality in his composed demeanor. Saul dealt with Douglas first. "I'm fine, but it would be right to say something happened too." "What did you discover?" Starlight pollution and black tide pollution are indeed completely different. Even without direct contact, it still affected my consciousness. "Good thing you broke free in time." Saul looked somewhat hesitant. "What's wrong? Are there still hidden dangers?" "No, it's just that I completely forgot what I saw when I contacted starlight pollution, but I'm certain I definitely saw something." "Ahem. Brother Saul, you lost your memory again." Douglas stroked his chin. "You're certain you saw something but can't remember anymore?" "Yes, I have no need to lie to you about this." "Indeed, as long as you don't say anything, we can't know these things." Douglas looked at the shell. "I think we need to study this matter carefully with the Stargate." Douglas went back to call people. Saul stood in place, finally having time to respond to Penny. "Why did you just say, 'I lost my memory again'?" "Brother Saul, did you forget? You once let me see your past, wasn't that your first memory loss?" Distant memories struck him, and Saul finally remembered. He had indeed forgotten how he came from his original world to this wizard world. Could it be that what made him forget the reason for crossing over was starlight pollution?